Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 626 for March 3rd, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this episode. I'm very, very excited to get into it. We are going to be continuing our Best Picture movie series in the back half of the episode.
Yeah.
As we get to 1961's West Side Story. And in the spirit of awards, of course, the Oscars happened this last weekend, so we have to talk about it. It is obligatory. And I am just fortunate to be here because, as some of you may know, the Oscars is the one night of the year where I get completely plastered. I don't really drink all that much, but the Oscars is very long. It's usually extremely awkward. And the only way for me to get through it is to be wholly buzzed. And
well, you're hiding that hangover very well right now. I gotta say.
I was gonna say.
What was your drink of choice again? You were rocking
gin.
Some gin. Wow.
Yeah, I'm a big gin guy.
With gin. Wow. Okay.
I'm a big gin guy, and so I had a lot of it. And I usually go hard every year for the Oscars, but I think I went the hardest last year than I have in probably the last 5 or 10 years.
Okay.
And in the spirit of what 2025 is going to be, and Brendan and I somewhat talked about this a few weeks ago here on the show, this is going to be a big year for me because I am getting old and I'm going to hit a milestone birthday that I'm not particularly looking forward to. But I will say I woke up this morning and I felt that I am on the verge of turning 40 because my body does not adjust like it did 20 years ago. I am struggling today so much. And I am thriving off of headache medicine and coffee and water. Like that's all I've consumed today. But I'm here.
Yeah, from what I hear, what might actually help even more, maybe a little more gin. Maybe just a little bit more gin.
Maybe I should just keep drinking and never stop. That could
hold the hair of the dog, my friend.
Yeah. So look, I had a great time last night. I had a great time. The Adrian Brody speech, no memory. I did not hear or see that.
Honestly, I think even sober people forgot about that speech already.
Yeah, I'm sure. We'll talk about it. But yeah, I had a good time last night. Had a good time. I just woke up very much feeling those choices, we shall say. All right, before we get into the Oscars, we actually have a guest joining us for this episode, and I'm very excited to bring back onto the show good friend Gerald from the Awards Garage. I love the rebrand, Gerald. It's fantastic. I love what you're doing. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, man. Absolutely. Thank you guys. I mean, you guys know I'm huge fans of both of you and InSession in general. And anytime I get a chance to come over here, I'm ready. Even after a JD hangover, I'm here. So.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I had to bring on backup just in case I fall over or something.
Yeah, right. Sure.
Yeah. In case you have to leave, JD, Gerald and I are running for it.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. Very much excited to have you here to give us your awards perspective. You've been talking about the award season quite a bit over there, and it's been very fun to see. So I'm excited to dig into the 97th Academy Awards with you guys. Let's just start with overall broad thoughts. Gerald, what did you think about the Oscar ceremony this year?
Well, I'm biased. I mean, I've been watching this show basically every year since like the early 90s, back when I used to watch with my dad, and he used to let me stay up late to watch it when I was 9th, 10th grade, and then up until today. So I've been watching it forever. So I'm biased. I always am really on board with this show in general, and it's kind of what I look forward to every year when it comes to kind of like the culmination of movie watching for the calendar year.
Yeah.
In terms of like, from an entertainment value perspective, I did think this was a really good show, personally, but I also know my bias is on display just because aside from my love for the Oscars, I love Conan O'Brien. Like, I mean, when I heard he was hosting, I mean, I was on a cloud. I mean, I love him. He's one of my favorite comedians, and I listen to his podcast. I used to watch all his late night shows. So I love that dude. I thought that was a match made in heaven. I thought he did a great job. I mean, there was a couple bits, maybe we'll get into specifics or whatever. There was a couple that, kind of fumbled a little bit, but I mean, overall, he was very quippy, very funny, and held his own in a very hard room to play, I would imagine, much like Nikki Glaser did with the Globes, too. I thought she was amazing when she did the Golden Globes. So we had another situation here of the hosts kind of fitting in the zone that they were in. So, and then when it comes to the awards, no problems. I mean, Amelia Perez only got 2, which are the 2 that I expected it to get.
Yeah, exactly.
And the evil was defeated, at the hands of Sean Baker, perhaps. But yeah, I was thrilled with most of the outcomes too. So all in all, I thought it was a great show.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I think it was a good show as well. Certainly, maybe not quite. It didn't quite have the same level of highs that we've seen in previous ceremonies, but it certainly didn't have some of the lows that we've seen in previous ceremonies as well. It was a very consistent show, and I think where this ceremony really succeeded for me, a lot of people have been talking about this on social media and even in various other YouTube videos that I've watched since watching the show last night. This definitely felt like a ceremony that really prioritized the love of film first, more so than we've seen in quite some time. It really felt like there was an affinity for movies than really, I don't want to say than ever before, because that's always been there, but perhaps more so than we've seen in the past few years. And maybe a lot of that is because of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding LA over the past few months, the wildfires in particular. So in many ways, this almost kind of felt like a eulogy is the wrong word, but definitely a tribute in some ways. And there was a sincerity that was definitely felt that I really did appreciate. And a lot of that maybe does come down to Conan O'Brien. I do think he was a very good host. He's just someone that, as a host in any way, just as a public figure, just has such a generosity to him that's able to come across even in his biting comedy. He's able to straddle that line with a great sense of balance. And I definitely felt that for the most part here with this show. We'll get into some other specifics, some things that certainly worked more than others, some things that didn't work at all, because there's always something worth talking about. I can't wait to get into those specifics, but I do think it was a good ceremony overall.
Yeah. I have to admit, I have my biases as well. I'm with Gerald. I think Conan is one of the best to ever do it. I was always going to love him. And as I noted, especially as we got later on in the evening, my senses were not cogent, we shall say. So take my thoughts maybe with a little gin and salt.
It's like, what do you remember?
I was going to say, I love how you're going to give a recap and you're going to be talking about how Oppenheimer won everything. And you're like, no.
Exactly. I saw Cillian Murphy. The score to Oppenheimer played last night. I got a little confused.
Brilliant.
On the whole, though, I did really like this ceremony a lot. I thought Conan was fantastic. I loved the opening monologue. We were all curious if he was going to address the Carla conversation, and he did so, gold. I think, in a playful way.
Tasteful, really.
Yeah, that didn't necessarily cross any sort of, like, he did it in a perfect Conan way that I thought was absolutely fantastic.
And he didn't linger on it. He didn't overdo it, which is what I was afraid like any host would do in that situation.
Exactly. I thought he did a really, really great job. As far as hosting, some of the gags maybe were a little unnecessary, but it's Conan, so I did enjoy them quite a lot. There are a few things that didn't really work. I'm sure we'll talk about the Bond moment. The In Memoriam music was a bit weird.
I'm going to go on a tangent about that shit when we get to it.
Maybe we should just start there and get the negatives out of the way.
We can get to that here in a moment. I'm sure we do have thoughts on it. Same thing with the In Memoriam music. I thought was quite strange. But I think on the whole, there was this celebratory vibe that was infectious that I very much did enjoy quite a lot. And maybe that comes down to Conan and the tone that he set for this. It was bringing on the firefighters and the celebrating of LA, that certainly played a role as well. And I think the winners, perhaps played a significant role as well, because there were a lot of great winners last night. Not all the categories went the way that I predicted or that I hoped that they would, but I think on the whole, this is a good crop of winners that I can very much live with. And so on the whole, it did feel more celebratory than a lot of other Oscar years. That leaves me a little bit cynical. And I've had a deep love-hate relationship with the Oscars for quite some time, but I thought last night was a really good show, despite it being a little messy. But with Conan hosting, that, I don't know, it feels kind of appropriate, if I'm being perfectly honest, because his comedic sensibilities are a little chaotic. And I'm sure he didn't have his hands in everything, such as the in memoriam music. That's not a Conan choice. Or the presentation styles, which some had clips, some had 5 people on stage. It felt like there was no rhyme or reason as to the presentation styles. It was kind of all over.
You know why they did that? It's really to, address the Carlos Sofia Gascon.
Yes, and that was a big part of it for sure.
And they tried to find this middle ground by not utilizing clips for the supporting acting performances, by having Robert Downey Jr. and Da'Vine Joy Randolph basically try to consolidate that 5-person format into one speech by one person, and it was just kind of awkward. And then they did clips anyway for the leading actors to get away from that whole thing. So it
was strange.
Yeah,
I don't know why they're allergic to clips. I'm just crazy. Like for the 4 acting categories, you should just do clips, like acting clips, a 10-second clip of their Oscar scene or whatever. I mean, Isabella Rossellini did the work for you. Just play her scene where she talks. That's her Oscar clip. You know what I mean? That's her dialogue from Conclave.
Yeah, it's designed for it.
That drives me nuts. But what I will say, though, is the Fab Five format that they were going to use for actors before the whole Carla debacle, they used for a lot of the crafts like cinematography, costume design,
which was cool.
And I thought that was brilliant. And that speaks to that speaks to Brendan's point earlier too about just kind of this different feeling around the art of film that we got in this broadcast, because they don't do that a lot. It's usually about the celebrity actors,
Yeah, and it also does a great thing for those watching the ceremony that maybe don't have the same kind of ties to the film world that we do, by essentially raising awareness for those things like cinematography and costume design for very innocent eyes and ears. Like, oh, maybe this is something I should pay attention to when I watch movies going forward. And that's, I hate to call it educational, but it kind of is. And I weirdly do appreciate that.
Yeah, and where I will differ from you, Gerald, and a lot of people, and trust me, I understand why people are drawn to clips. My problem with the clips, and this is purely subjective on my part, I'm certainly willing to admit, I just feel like the clips that they often play are not that interesting to me, because what the Academy likes as far as acting is concerned are loud, bombastic moments that, to me, even if it's a performance that I love, that's often the least interesting aspect of the performance.
Yeah.
I think there's often way
something
more
that's
interesting going on in the subtle moments or in other aspects of the performance. So the clips don't really do all that much for me personally. However, when you get on stage and you have Robert Downey Jr. talking about Jeremy Strong and invoking an inherent emotional response out of him that you wouldn't get from a clip, that I find way more compelling. So the Fab Five approach, I actually really, really love. Again, I'm not totally against clips. I just wish that they were more thoughtful and less trite with the clips. But I think you can have a marriage of both. And last night, I thought, again, as random as it seemed, and they did have to kind of adjust on the fly. I get it.
Yeah.
But I kind of love the mixture. I kind of like doing both, and it does make it a little refreshing from category to category. It is not necessarily the same.
Yeah, I think it was just a lack of consistency in the acting categories specifically that that maybe I'm more critical of, because we can really see the seams of them trying to get away from some type of controversy that they were really hiding from. And for those who are tied to it, we could just sense those strings more than anything else. I don't necessarily dislike clips, but to your point, JD, it's hard to represent a great performance in a matter of seconds, especially when it's a very understated performance. Sometimes a great performance, it's because of how it functions in totality. You can't pick something out of it and it just doesn't work in that regard. So it can be hit or miss in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, to JD's point, or really to both of your points, I mean, you guys know I do my own award show, and I always, as an editor, put together a clip package for the acting nominees, most of them. But to JD's point, I always try to find, which is hard to do, but I try to find like a 10-second or less clip that kind of illustrates the depth of whatever character got nominated, and it's not easy to do, to your point. And when the SAG Awards happened a couple weeks ago, Timothée Chalamet is one of my personal favorites, and I was pulling for him all season, and they play his damn clip, and it's like him doing a song on stage, for like 5 seconds. And it's like, that does, that doesn't
cut it. That doesn't cut it.
Portrayal of Dylan, and for somebody that hadn't seen the movie, they're not going to get the, emotionality of his performance from that 10-second, performance.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, or like an example that comes to mind for me of recent is like Sandra Huller's performance in Anatomy of a Fall. That is a mostly understated performance, or at least there's more subtlety to it than there is the largeness when she gets vocal. But that's the only clip they played all award season. The one time she goes crazy at the end. And that is the least interesting aspect of that performance to me. But it's the one clip that they use because she gets loud, and look, I'm capital A acting.
It was great marketing for that movie. Great campaign.
I mean, it's a great an excellent performance. Performance. But the excellence for me comes in everything else surrounding it other than that one clip. And she's good in that moment. The film calls for her to do that in that scene. I'm not saying it's not good. I just feel like there are better clips that exemplify what that performance is about.
In a way where the Fab Five does also work for acting specifically, it goes back to trying to cater to those who are watching the ceremony that maybe aren't film critics like we are, that are just bystanders of all of this and are just curious about these movies. So then here are these great actors talking about the great work that's nominated, and they're essentially telling the audience why it's good. So then the audience doesn't have to do that work for themselves. They maybe don't think like critics. So in a way, it kind of helps maybe spark that interest and curiosity even further. So there is definitely something to be said about having that in the first place.
Look, if there's like emotionality to it and there's an actual connection between the presenter and the nominee, that shit hits me. Like, you mentioned the Jeremy Strong stuff. Like, I teared up during that.
It's sincere.
I knew
very sincere.
I knew he wasn't going to win, but that full circle moment for him and the camera on him in the audience when he kind of realizes, so the gravity of his career, essentially. Yeah, it's impactful.
It still gave him a moment, which is great.
It gave him a moment that otherwise wouldn't be there. So, like, again, I think there's a duality to it. Again, I think clips can be good. I like clips. I like the humanity that comes out of the Fab Five.
It would. You guys got to admit, though. You guys got to admit, though, it would have been interesting to see who would have said for Carla and what the hell they would have said. That would have been really interesting.
I am so curious about that
face,
now.
Oh my god.
Oh my goodness. That would have been wild.
It's like was forced into this.
Yeah. I do want to talk a little bit about the Bond thing. Let's go ahead and get to the Bond thing. I know we have thoughts there. So let's get that out of the way before we move on to anything else. And I'll give you the floor, Gerald.
I mean, my main thing with it, look, I like James Bond. I got no problem with the franchise. A bunch of those movies I hold dear. Roger Moore was my Bond based on the era when I grew up. But I mean, love it. I love it. I have no problem celebrating it. I understand the tie-in with the Governor's Awards, and they mentioned that briefly at the top. Margaret Qualley being in there, I love her, but that was like a jump scare. Like I didn't know she was going to be in it. I was like, "What?"
That was
I didn't know what was happening, But anyway, the thing with me that really bothers me about it is because they talk about saving time and making the show tight, and then they do this like 7 or 8 minute performance surrounding Bond. That I didn't really feel connected to the rest of the show, but what I was going to say, what really, really bothers me about it is then you go on past that point and you have them playing off people that are accepting their Academy Award. And they're ending, speeches like way too early. They cut off Daniel Blumberg when he was doing his original score for The Brutalist.
I hated that.
Yeah, that was all pun intended. That was brutal.
It was brutal. Yeah.
Walter Sellis, they cut off for International Feature, which was one of my favorite awards of the night, and they cut him off before he was officially
Did not
done.
Like that either. Yeah.
I mean, it's like, what are we doing? Why did you do this 8-minute thing that, frankly, very few people probably cared about? If you're going to be cutting off people that may be on stage for the only time in their lives receiving arguably the greatest achievement they're ever going to have. So that is really what bothers me about it. The performance itself was a train wreck. I mean, whatever. I mean, say what you want to say. It was not very good, but I'm okay with that. Like, we don't always have amazing, choreographed whatever. And it's all in fun and we're celebrating the movies, but I just hated how stuff like that takes away from really what the show's about for me personally.
Well, it's the principle of it that makes it even worse because it is taking away from what they promised this show would hopefully fix. And that's really giving people space to feel recognized and to take advantage of their moment. And this is a great example of a sequence that robbed people of their moment in many ways. And it didn't have it didn't have the strength to back it up. It just wasn't good. As you said, it was kind of a train wreck. It just, as its own thing in a vacuum, it was pretty horrible. It felt like something that they slapped together 24 hours before they aired it. And I think a lot of it was not just the tie to Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson and the Governor's Awards, which was really the trigger for it, but there were a lot of other comedic allusions to Amazon. So in many ways, I felt like this was kind of being treated like a Bond eulogy in some ways. Maybe that was kind of the purpose of it. So Barbara and Michael can have something like this happen as if to suggest we're no longer tied to Bond. Whatever happens next is not our fault. So have at it what you will. But the choices that were made were just such a head scratch to me. The song choices in particular were kind of randomized. Those who actually performed them were also very randomized and didn't do a very good job either. Even Doja Cat has openly admitted since the airing of the show that the nerves got the best of her. And you can kind of tell. Like there were sequences where her hand was even shaking during her performance of Diamonds Are Forever.
And that's understandable.
But I mean, to put it as politely as possible, because she is very adamant about this now. She did a horrible job. It was not good. And then you have Ray coming out to sing Skyfall, and I'm thinking, where's Adele? She's still alive. She's still, now
that would have been huge. Now, had Adele came in and saved the day with Skyfall, we would be talking about this is the greatest segment we've ever seen. The Academy Awards.
But it's like Adele is still active, right? So it makes me think, was she even asked? Well, I don't know if she was or not. The whole thing was a giant question mark, which makes it even worse given how much time it was wasting.
So weird.
Well, it's a giant question mark for that. And also, I am curious why they chose to do this when they did a Bond tribute 3 years ago at the Oscars.
Yeah.
3 years ago, there was a Bond tribute.
Yeah.
Why are we doing it again? Unless the answer is, and it has nothing to do with the Governor Awards, but it is indeed a eulogy. If that's what it was, and there's no way they would have been able to program this months ago to plan for this, knowing that Amazon was going to take over. That is purely a coincidence. But if they had reshifted their thinking foundationally and they treated this as a eulogy, and then you end with a black screen that just says R.I.P. James Bond 1962 to 2025, that would have been great. Then it would have made sense to me. But it didn't do that. And then you couple that with what you guys are saying as far as the execution of it, which admittedly was a bit awkward and strange. I don't know if it bothered me as much. The alcohol helped. But
all right. There you go. Sure.
I will admit it was a messy moment, though. It was a little strange.
Yeah.
No doubt about it.
My wife made a pretty interesting observation during it. We were both sitting on the couch watching the ceremony, and we got about halfway through this Bond tribute, and we kind of looked at each other and both unspokenly recognized that this is just not working. What's going on with this?
I don't understand the purpose of it.
But then a few seconds later, she said something that I thought, okay, maybe she's right. It didn't do this, but I thought maybe this is what they're doing. She said, "Oh, I think they're going to announce the next James Bond." And it was like, who? Maybe because
Even that
it
would've
felt
made
like it
no
was
sense.
built.
That's
It just felt
that
like it
came
was
up in our room as well.
Yeah, because it just felt like it was
Yeah.
building to something, like some type of announcement or something. That's the only way I can justify why it was even here in this awkward setting. But it didn't do that, which made it even more awkward by the time it actually concluded.
Yeah, it was
a bit weird.
crazy. It was strange, very, very strange.
That aside, the only other thing that didn't really work for me throughout the night, because I do want to focus on this being a celebration of movies, because I do think it was a good night on the whole. But the only other thing for me was the in memoriam music did not work. I don't know what that was all about. And
what was it? Mozart's Requiem, I think they used for it, which just tonally was kind of awkward and kind of morbid in a way that was calling attention to death in the bad ways.
It was strange. There was a great viral tweet about how it seemed as if they were foreshadowing that they were going to bring these people back from the dead. Which
Wow.
great.
They're resurrecting
But
them.
that's how it felt with them.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
It was a strange choice. That aside, they also missed some big ones that unfortunately passed away over the last year. And I was saddened that they didn't do more of a thing for David Lynch. I kind of wish that they would have given him a little bit more space. Not that you have to give him a 10-minute tribute or anything of that sort, but
no. I mean,
especially
Isabel Rossellini shows up in Blue Velvet. So
exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, a legend with a legendary move like that, to give her 2 minutes to talk about David Lynch, I think would have been really, really great. And maybe it's a good thing that didn't happen, because I would have melted. I would not have been able to make it through the rest of the show if she did that. But yeah, I don't know. Selfishly, I kind of wish that they did that.
Even to have her come on, I mean, it would have to be her, I would think. I mean, that would have been perfect. But even to have her come on and do an introduction to like a 2-minute montage of Lynch's, career in Hollywood. I mean,
instead of Bond, get rid of the Bond, do the Lynch.
Get rid of Bond.
Or even cut that Bond segment down to 6 minutes instead of 8. We still get our Lynch
exactly.
I mean, you can have Isabel Rossellini do it, but even Laura Dern, I think, was in attendance as well.
Yeah.
There are people there that could do that and fill those shoes for that.
Absolutely.
Definitely a missed opportunity for sure, not just with David Lynch, but to your point, JD, there are a few individuals that we would have loved to see recognized during the in memoriam. And this happens every single year. I don't envy those that have to do the research to put that segment together, because it must be really difficult. But it is unfortunate that we didn't get Tony Todd in there, or Bernard Hill, or very recently Michelle Trachtenberg, who was someone I loved growing up watching her in movies like Harriet the Spy. I kind of have a bit of a nostalgic connection to that actress. I do recognize that people like Michelle Trachtenberg and even Sharon Doherty, who also passed away as well. There may be more tied to television.
Olivia Hussey too.
Olivia Hussey as well. Some of them very much have more television ties, maybe. So it's probably easy that they got overlooked, but I'm not justifying that reason. But at the same time, this happens every year. People sadly get forgotten in the in memoriam, and we want to give credit where credit is due.
Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and talk about the winners. Let's talk about who won these categories. And of course, we have to begin with Sean Baker, who wins 4 Oscars this last weekend.
It's a record. Kind of a record.
It's a record. Ties a record, right? Walt Disney won 4 Oscars.
Well, because Bong Joon-ho didn't get his international, right? Because it went to the country or whatever.
Because it went to the country. So Bong Joon-ho came the closest. But Walt Disney did win 4 Oscars back in 1952, was
different
it?
movies,
but
I
for
believe.
That's the thing. It was for different movies. There were a few shorts in there that he won for. So, I think this is the first time that a single person has won that many, but all for the same film.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. A feature film at that. Really impressive. I like Nora as a Best Picture winner. I think it's a really good movie. Really enjoyed it a lot. His speeches I thought were really interesting as well. His editing speech was especially wonderful. And the way he's able to mock himself, I thought was great. What do you guys think about Nora winning Best Picture?
Yeah, I mean, Brendan, I'll just go real quick. I love it. I mean, I think if you guys have seen any of my videos in the last couple of months, you probably know that I was just so amped for this moment, and it ended up happening. So, I mean, Dune Part 2 was my best my favorite among the nominees, but I also knew that stood zero chance to win anything other than maybe a couple texts, which it did. So kind of knowing that and accepting that, Anora was definitely next best for me in terms of having the ability to win the big awards.
Yeah.
And what I think is awesome, aside from it being in my top 5 of the year, which it was, and then ending up as a Best Picture winner, which hasn't happened for me personally since Parasite. It just doesn't happen that often. Once every 7 or 8 years, my favorite movie or one of my favorite movies will win Best Picture. It just doesn't always line up that way with my personal taste or whatever. But one thing I think is great aside from that part for me personally is what we're seeing with this Academy and what we've seen over the last, like, kind of building this fortitude of change over the last 5 years. And Anora was made for $6 million. It's an independent movie. And not only that, it's an independent filmmaker that champions nothing but indie film and the theater going experience. And I think that says a lot for coming off the heels of something like Oppenheimer, which is $1 billion behemoth. And then you go to this small indie that was made for nothing in Anora. And I love the diversity in the choices that have been made lately in the last 5-6 years. And I think Anora is a great punctuation mark on that. And a lot of people in my live stream that I did after the show and reacting to the winners and stuff, a lot of people that came in, there were probably Anora haters in fairness, but they would come into my chat and they would say that Anora doesn't feel like a Best Picture winner. It doesn't feel like an Oscar movie. And I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I also think that's
not
a
a bad
positive thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
but
what
how
I said
are we
is,
defining that these days? Because
what I
Best
said-
Picture 10 years ago, maybe Anora doesn't fit that mold.
Yeah.
After 2016, it's more in the mold than I would argue.
Yeah.
And what I said in so many words to a lot of the people that were commenting about that is, I said, I get what you're saying, but the Best Picture doesn't always have to be a biopic about an old white dude that, created whatever. And you know what I mean? Like, we can have these weird Everything Everywhere stories where they're fighting with dildos in the hallway. You know what I mean? Like, we can have these weird genre stories and they can be the best movie. Like, it's okay, and I think that people have to let go of that stuffy kind of perspective when it comes to what an Academy friendly film is. And that's one of the big reasons why I was really thrilled with Anora too.
It's no longer a narrow-minded viewpoint like maybe it was before. Best Picture winners don't feel like they used to, which is interesting. It's interesting. And it's even more interesting that a movie like Oppenheimer, at least maybe within the span 5 or 6 years, Oppenheimer is kind of the outlier in a way. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago it wasn't, but here it kind of is. And I think what's interesting about Anora being a Best Picture winner now in the context of this new reshaping of the Academy, like you said, Gerald, it does kind of feel like this exclamation point or this punctuation mark, kind of like this sealing of the deal in many ways, because this isn't the first time that we're seeing a movie that's essentially an indie darling going on to be an Oscar frontrunner and then winning Best Picture. We've seen this before. This dates all the way back to a movie like Moonlight even winning Best Picture, or maybe even a movie like Spotlight winning Best Picture.
Nomadland? I know that was a weird year, but it's in the same vein.
Yeah. Sure. So this isn't the first time that this has happened, but the thing about Anora, for some reason, it kind of feels like the first time, even though it isn't. And I think that's because Sean Baker himself has been such a prominent figure in the world of indie cinema. Like, we just recognize this man as such a prominent figure in that regard. So to see him go on to win as well as he did, it makes this win for independent cinema feel more like that exclamation mark than ever before, even if it's not necessarily the first to do it. That made it feel like a very interesting and fulfilling win to me. It was my favorite of the nominees, so I was happy for it in that regard, even though usually I don't like when my favorite wins because I'm always worried about what the backlash is going to be.
Sure.
The best thing that can happen for the movies you love is if they lose awards. Like, that's just
I actively root against my favorites winning. I'm so thrilled that Nickel Boys was never in the conversation. I would have loved to have seen it win, movie. But after today and seeing what became of Anora, I do not regret at all that Nickel Boys stayed away from that hellscape.
Yeah, but
my goodness,
I'm not worried about Anora's victory as much as, let's say, the vitriol for other films that may have won in the past. I'm not expecting a Moonlight / La La Land type rivalry to form with this one. I know the movie has its detractors, Anora specifically, but I feel like there's still enough of a positive conversation around Sean Baker's representation for indie film that might make the narrative still feel more positive when we look at it historically in a few years. I think this will be a good thing.
I'm still
I don't
kind
think
of
this is
blown
gonna.
away. I'm still kind of blown away that he's not just an Oscar winner, a 4-time Oscar winner, Best Director and Best Picture, because just a few years ago, it didn't seem like it was that long ago. The Florida Project came out, I believe, in 2017. So it's been almost a decade, even though it doesn't feel like it. But his movies have never felt awardsy in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, a big part of the discourse today, aside from the film itself, was, of course, centered on Sean Baker. And it's interesting because people were pointing out that his first few films were with A24. He moves over to Neon for Anora, partially because I don't think he liked the release strategy of Red Rocket. But the thing about Red Rocket and the Florida Project, even if A24 did open up the playbook, those films were not nearly as accessible as Anora is. They would not have garnered, at least I don't think they would have, the same successes that Anora did. I think it was a concoction of him creating a movie that was accessible, Neon opening up the playbook more than A24 ever did, and to see the run that he had over the last year is fascinating. Even when the film won the Palme d'Or, I was still taken aback by that. And for him to run from Cannes all the way to the Oscars, I believe that's just the 4th film, right, to win the Palme and the Oscar Best Picture winner.
Parasite
I think
did it too.
it's only
So
happened a handful of times.
Neon's got something going on. Yeah, absolutely. In the last like 7 years.
Well.
So yeah.
And
one thing I want to say
wild.
to piggyback on what you're saying, JD, too, is, and I watched the show last night and I filmed my reaction, so I don't check social media or anything when I'm watching the Oscars, which is probably a good thing. So I just watch the show, and I watch it with my son. So he's 11. So I go back and forth with him, and I'm out here and I'm in there and I'm just watching the show, not paying attention to any noise that's going on. And then I did a live stream right after, and that ended, I don't know, around 1 a.m. So I went to bed, I got up, I went to work, and I came home. I really haven't seen any discourse as of yet. So you guys are going to have to fill me in. But one thing I want to say real quick about
I'm
Anora.
so lucky, or I'm so jealous of you.
One thing I want to say about Anora, though, and why I think it's pretty revolutionary and kind of piggyback on what you guys are already saying, is that the reason this one hits different. Now, it could be Neon, maybe to Sean Baker's point, or, what we think maybe his point is. Maybe Neon's better with the strategy. I mean, they did it with Parasite just a few years ago. I mean, who knows? Maybe that's part of it, too.
Yeah.
But in my mind, he's benefiting in 2025 from what would have been a lot harder for him to benefit from in 2017 with the Florida Project. Now, I wasn't as high on Red Rocket as some people. It's probably his worst movie in my opinion. I mean, I didn't hate it, but I would never be like, let's win Best Picture for Red Rocket.
Yeah, it's a movie I don't think I recommend to almost anybody. Like, I love the movie, but it's I have a hard time recommending that
it's
one.
It's definitely not as digestible as something like Florida Project.
It's a gross movie.
Right. But one thing I'll say that made this movie hit at the right moment is it benefited from several years of this kind of shifting in the Academy, like we've talked about. Much more indie friendly, much more auteur friendly, just different, which is kind of what we've been saying. But also, people are gonna, and I'm sure a lot of the discourse might surround the lead actress race, but Sean Baker had the benefit of a literal Star is Born powerhouse performance that rivals any performance you pick out of the last decade from Mikey Madison. And her performance specifically as Anora, as Annie, the titular character, was so engaging and magnetic and such a dedicated performance that you could tell was really honed in on the craft of what she was doing in that role and how serious she took it. And I think that had Honora as a film not had such a committed, holy shit, welcome to the world performance that we got from her, it wouldn't be in as many awards conversations as it was this year.
Yeah.
I put a lot of weight in what she did in that movie. I really do.
I think you're onto something as to what made Honora stand out in that way, because while it was still an independent film made for only $6 million, I think that's what its budget was, which is pretty small compared to other movies that were probably nominated that same night.
Absolutely.
The movie still felt very cinematic. Like, it felt like a movie going experience. And a lot of that is primarily due to Mikey Madison's star-making performance, which gives it such a loudness factor. And I think maybe Honora winning also plays into this narrative that we're starting to see with movies, let's say distributed by Neon or even A24, really trying to play in this bigger sandbox. They're trying to distribute movies that may be a little bit more expensive, but not too expensive that they can hopefully still make their money back. You know, like a movie like Longlegs being such a big hit as it was last year. I think Honora winning maybe is setting this new precedent that a great movie-going experience can also have a mid-sized budget. And maybe this can be a new trend going forward. And JD, this is something we've talked about on the show many times. So perhaps Honora winning here is a start for a new narrative here, which is why it does kind of feel like this culmination of indie cinema coming together in a new way. It's kind of exciting in that regard.
No, I think we are seeing a shift for sure. I mean, it all starts with Moonlight. I know we've had this conversation a lot of times, but with what we've seen in recent years, and Oppenheimer was this huge movie last year, and it was always going to be big. Obviously, the Barbenheimer of it all amplified it to a new degree. But generally, as we've already noted, we've seen this trend start to move the Academy in a different direction that I don't think is changing anytime soon. I think we're going to start to see more of these movies winning. And it's not just indicative with Sean Baker and the Honoras of the world, although I certainly do love that. But you look at the animated category the last 2 years, international animation.
Last
winning,
3 years,
and
really.
It took forever for us to get to this point for international animation to be recognized at the Oscars in a real way. A lot of the time, they've always been nominated, but they've never had a real shot at winning until the last few years. It's like Guillermo del Toro's Plea a few years ago has started to resonate with people, and they are taking that category seriously. I obviously love The Wild Robot. I deeply wanted it to win last night, but I also love Flow. I was very, very excited for Flow to get that win, and I think that's also indicative of this change. So yeah, we're going to start to see more of these movies winning. And Honora, going back to Sean Baker, I do think it was a culmination of a few things. Mikey Madison's performance is a big part of it. I do agree. I also think that Baker's writing is equally vital to that movie because it is his most accessible. It's by far his most diverting. I love The Florida Project. That to me is one of the best films of the 2010s. I love Red Rocket, but I agree with you, Brendan. Can't recommend that to a single soul. Even The Florida Project is hard to recommend to people.
No, but Honora is the first film of his. I feel like I could probably recommend to some of those same people that I wouldn't recommend his other films to.
I agree. Like, it is way more diverting than his other movies, and there is an accessibility to it. And him jumping from A24 to Neon, and they're able to open things up for them. And look, I kind of look at Sean Baker, if we're going to treat this as sports, and I do love that we're starting to embrace that more, I guess. I look at Sean Baker like I do Matthew Stafford. They are the same people in the sense that Sean Baker was doing great things on his team. Now, he was never going to make the postseason, but he was still doing really great things. He just needed to go to a new team that had a different system that allowed him to win a Super Bowl.
That's actually a good
exactly
analogy.
What happened.
Yeah,
it's
that's actually a really good analogy.
Narrative.
Yeah.
And
you came up with that analogy when you were on the gin, didn't you? That's
yeah,
good. That's
good.
I like that.
This just in, folks. Drinking makes you smarter.
It works. Yeah.
Exactly. Turns out it's scientific.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the same narrative, and I love that for Sean Baker. And I think all those factors kind of accumulated for him to have the kind of night he did. And I know there's been some polarization. God bless you, Gerald, for missing it to this point.
Hit me with it. So what is it mostly like around Demi Moore's? I mean, first of all,
No. Like a lot of there could be some of that. Most of the discourse that I've seen is centered around the film itself, people like how they feel about Sean Baker and his politics, and it's about the film. Right. Is it pro sex worker? Is it anti-sex worker? There's a lot of discourse around that. And a lot of the criticisms I've seen are, I think, wild misinterpretations of the film. That's my opinion. There are certainly a few detractors that are offering valid criticisms that I think even as fans of that movie, we can wrestle with.
Are they I'm just curious. Are they criticisms of the film, of the production, or are they criticisms like of him?
It's both. I mean? A little bit of both.
Okay. And when they're criticizing the quote unquote production, it's more so to do with maybe the ethics of the movie and what it's choosing to convey, and whether it did the right type of research to support the kind of community that's being represented on screen.
Yeah,
that's definitely another part of it as well, which I think are valid conversations to have if there is a valid viewpoint to be, brought to the table. And in some cases there are. I don't want to invalidate those perspectives. But to your point, JD, there are some examples that have been presented in bad faith against them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of bad faith arguing. And again, this comes down to the sports of it all. My team lost the Super Bowl and I'm super pissed about it. And I'm going after the winner. Yeah. This happens every goddamn year. Parasite, I think, was immune to this. Oppenheimer, to a degree, was immune to it. But a lot of it is people in bad faith arguing in a way that it's as if they've never seen the film. They just saw clips on Twitter or on YouTube or TikTok and feel a certain way about those clips and then get all angry about it. Like, that's genuinely how it feels. Like, they're not making any sort of good faith argument. Now, there are critics out there that I respect and admire that are making valid criticisms. That's different. That's not what I'm talking about. A lot of the viral discourse, the viral vitriol, that is coming from bad faith. That's coming from my team lost. And I'm mad
and to I think it was Brendan's point earlier, but also, and I will say that, and I haven't seen it firsthand yet. I mean, I probably will in the next few days, but that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't won Best Picture, right? They're coming after it because it's the top of the mountain right now. It has a bullseye on it right now.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say real quick too, which has a bit of comedy to it, but I don't really intend for this to be funny, but it kind of is. What all these people don't realize, we dodged a bullet, because when you're talking about representation, I know it could have been a lot worse if a movie like Emilia Perez had rose like we thought it was going to. When you're talking about trans community, Latino communities, whatever. I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of the sex worker representation and the discourse around it, but I know it could have been a lot worse.
It definitely could have been a lot worse. So we should count our blessings where we have them.
I think so. Yeah.
I think it's a good movie. I think it's a good winner. I like it. I'm putting it up there with some of the best we've seen out of the last decade for sure.
And it's a grower. JD, when we first saw the film, we were both high on it, but we still had some reservations and thinking that it wasn't as good as some of Sean Baker's other films. But I did give it a second go round and it ended up in my top 5 of the year. And I love when movies kind of have that effect. And a lot of it is because I think the ending was just the scene of the year. Like, it's amazing what a great can do to a movie.
Real good.
Real quick, since it's top of mind, we're talking about sports. I got another sports analogy I want to bring to the table here.
Okay.
Because Diane Warren lost again last night. And I know that this is an ongoing count, right? How many has she lost at this point? Like 57
16.
times.
I think 16 is the actual number, but
like
it might as well be 57 at this point.
We have to do something. I mean, we got to figure this out.
So here's my analogy. Now, this will be less mainstream, but for my people of the 90s, the hockey fans of the world, you're going to get this. But I want to bring up a name that you guys won't know, but I'm going to bring some context. Don't worry. There was a gentleman in the 90s that played for the Boston Bruins. His name was Ray Bourque. He was a monster. Great defenseman. One of the all-time Boston Bruins. He played for the Bruins for 22 years. 22 years. Never won a Stanley Cup.
That's incredible.
22 years, one team, no Stanley Cup. Well, he's on the verge of retirement because 22 years in the league, you're like 57 at that point. And
That's even past the whole Brett Favre analogy you can make with that.
yeah, I mean, I'm being facetious. He was probably near 40 though. 22 years is a long time for any sport.
Really long.
Professional
Sport like that too.
So his last year, he gets traded to the Colorado Avalanche. And this is the late 90s. This is when the Avalanche and the Red Wings, my Red Wings, are bitter rivals, really going back and forth. And he gets traded to the Avs, who go to the Stanley Cup Finals, and they go on to win the Stanley Cup. So here's where it gets interesting, right? So again, for non-NHL fans, when you win the Stanley Cup, the commissioner of the league comes out with the trophy, hands it to the captain. The captain raises it. The crowd goes nuts. You skate around, and then you take it to the next player. And there's usually a specific order that the team figures out beforehand.
Yeah.
With Ray Bourque, that's not how it played out. Joe Sakic, the captain of the Avalanche, goes and gets the cup from Gary Bettman. He does not raise it above his head. He skates immediately to Ray Bourque. And even as a Red Wings fan, I'm watching this, and the hair on the back of your neck is standing up. He skates directly to Ray Bourque. Ray Bourque takes it, and you can see like the man is like on the verge of like falling apart. Like he's so emotional, and he raises it, and you get this. It's this iconic, legendary moment in the world of the NHL where a man who played forever, never won a Stanley Cup, 22 years in the league, finally gets his moment. That is how it's going to feel when Diane Warren finally wins. And I hope they bring back the same announcer from that Ray Bourque moment.
But
I hope
the thing
she
is,
raises it in the air, and it's going to be this glorious moment where we all scream like, "Oh my God!" You'll remember where you were when it
skates
happens.
off the stage if they do it on an ice rink. You know?
Exactly.
Why are the Oscars in an NHL stadium this year? You'll see. You'll see.
Exactly.
It's at Wells Fargo Center here in Philadelphia or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
But like to your point, to compare it to the Ray Bourque analogy there, clearly he had the right moment given to him to finally, win this coveted award, right? So we're basically saying Diane Warren needs the right movie to give her that victory. Like
that's the other part of this, right? And it's got to be a big team, right? The Avalanche were heavy contenders to win the cup that year. So she can't be doing a small little Netflix movie that nobody saw.
It's
got to be for the next Christopher Nolan movie. Nolan, bring her in. Let's get this done. Let's get it done. It's been 22 years.
You know who is really good, or what filmmaker and his films are really good at capitalizing on big, grand, female sung spectacles? James Cameron. So let's get her for a new Avatar movie.
The new Avatar. I love it. That might even be better. Let's do it.
I made an observation in my reaction video that I kept in when I edited it together because I cracked myself up, and it was just like a thing I said off the cuff, But of course, Dune won visual effects, which means Planet of the Apes is kind of. I said that's the Diane Warren of visual effects at this point. The Planet of the Apes.
It is.
Right?
Yeah,
because it's not winning either. After
it's a good point.
And then I said, why don't we get Diane Warren to do the next Planet of the Apes original song for the next movie of that, and then we'll just do it all at one time.
They can sit in a bar together and drink their sorrows away.
It's crazy.
Seriously.
Yeah.
So good. At any rate, so that's my Dan Warren story. Any other categories? Where do you guys want to go next?
You mentioned the flow thing, but I just want to touch on it real quick because I didn't really get to comment when you brought it up. But I think that win is actually probably the most interesting win of the show this year, because going along with Boy and the Heron and even the year before, I mean, obviously that was Miyazaki, and that's got a whole element built into it as well. And I understand the dude's a legend and whatever, it's apples and oranges. But if you didn't know that was Miyazaki and you were just a bystander looking at the two films, they're
Mhm.
very similar, and they both defeated these kind of large animation studio, films that were being presented with Spider-Verse, and then
Yeah.
of course the Wild Robot this year. All the films are great, but
Yeah.
I think it just does symbolize that at least that animation branch, they're not playing by any rules that we thought they were playing by, even 3 years ago.
Yeah.
It's like
Mm.
whatever the most artistic, interesting film to them when voting is open is what's going to win. And Flow was that this year. Now, if the Oscar voting had been like 2 or 3 weeks before, even the Wild Robot probably would have won. But
Yeah.
Flow hit
Yeah.
at the right time, and the whole Latvian thing with the dude doing in his basement with his dog and shit. I mean, that shit is like gold. I mean, like, of course I'm gonna vote for that if I'm voting. So.
Yeah, it was just so simple and sincere, but it's the kind of thing that does go viral. And I don't know if that was the intent or if it just happened to be a bit of a fluke in helping that movie's awards campaign.
Right.
Regardless, it definitely was an asset. It really was in
I
supporting.
mean,
that
and
movie
you
making
talk
it
about complete grassroots marketing. That's another film that was only made for a few $1 million.
Mhm.
It comes out and he was everywhere. That dude went everywhere. He played his movie at Pixar, at Disney, at Leica Studios, everywhere. That man was all over social media. He won that award exclusively by going out and doing the work. There was no marketing budget for him. He just went out and did it himself, which I think is incredible.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this is also
for the
why
Oscars and all of the pandering and marketing you have to do for a lot of these films that spend millions of dollars to win these awards, for him to just go out on social media and just post about his cat 100 million times, incredible.
This is why. This is why some of Brady Corbett's words a few weeks ago are so important, because he often talked about how he made this 3.5-hour movie and really hasn't gotten paid for it, primarily because of how much work they have to do themselves to promote their work. And here the filmmaker of Flow is essentially doing the same thing. You can't help but wonder, as great of a win as this was, has he actually been set back in the process financially? And it is something to talk about. I think it's a separate conversation though, but it does
like a sacrifice that he makes for the art, essentially.
Yeah,
I mean,
and you
I
have
agree
to
with you.
respect that.
Yeah.
One thing
Yeah,
I'll say
it's
too about
an
just to
incredible
wrap up
win.
before we go to whatever category you want to talk about next, but another thing too, and this what I'm about to say would also apply to a movie like I'm Still Here, which upset Amelia Present International, but with I'm Still Here and Flow, these are movies that the passion behind these things is like freaking crazy. Like, I had people from Latvia waking up because it was like 7:00 in the morning when I was doing my stream last night, and they're like going into my stream like, I mean, Flow was like for the country of Latvia.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about what that means. Like, us as Americans, like, what if a movie won an award and the entire country was like, this represents me? Do you know what I mean? And there's something really, really powerful about that. And it's the same thing with Brazil.
Yeah.
When it comes to I'm Still Here. And I think that's just infectious as a movie fan. You just love it. And plus, I love the movies too, which helps.
Yeah.
I know.
Like
I know
that
you
whole
said
viral
earlier-
thing of like Brazil watching it on that screen, and
That's
God,
exactly
yes.
what I was going to bring up. Yeah.
So
I don't know if you
special,
saw
man.
that,
So
Gerald, or
special.
not, but
I did.
Oh my
I saw it
gosh.
because you know why I saw it? This is my point, because Brazilian people that are fans of mine on YouTube tagging me in it. And that's how I saw it.
That's
They're
amazing.
like, you got to see
It's
this.
amazing.
And it's like the festivals and the carnival was going on. And another thing I really pointed out in that video too, I don't know if you guys noticed, but there's one of them where they're watching it on the thing as it's playing out and they're booing Amelia Perez. They're going through all the nominees.
yeah.
And then the next one is Flo and they're cheering for Flo. I'm like, yes, Brazil knows what's up. Yeah, I know I've been hating on Amelia Perez, but that was one of my least favorite
I mean,
movies
I think
of
it
the year,
deserves
so.
hate at this point.
But yeah, I just think that's special
It
because
does.
it's hard for us to kind of get our minds around it, because again, like even Oppenheimer, which was like celebrated around the world. I mean, it's not like America was like carrying a sense of pride about you. You get what I'm saying? Like
it's not like they were in the streets watching a live stream of the Oscars and cheering for it on the streets of Philadelphia, like when the Eagles won the Super Bowl. It wasn't like that.
Right. So there's something special about that, I think.
Yeah.
It is very special, and I think stuff like that is indicative to what we were talking about earlier in regards to this shift that's taking place. And the international scene is certainly having its impact on the Oscars for better or worse. For, you know, you get the flows of the world, but you also get the Emilio Perez's. So you just have to kind of balance those scales a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. It always
and
happens.
ultimately, in the end, justice, I think, was served. Emilio Perez
dodged
won
that
the
thing,
two
yeah.
that was most predicted. And you get a flow. You get an I'm Still Here winning those categories, which is incredible. And my favorite win of the night, No Other Land, winning for documentary.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. For them to go on stage to give that speech, truly a sensational moment in Oscars history. And I don't know if that film wins documentary if it's just based on U.S. Academy members only. I don't think it does. It's gotten zero distribution, obviously. No studio has touched that. But the international scene, those members carried that movie to the point where it was able to win documentary. And that, to me, I think was maybe the highlight of the night. What a moment that was.
Yeah. Yeah. That was great.
I didn't know if you guys were going to talk about lead actress, but I definitely do want to hear your takes on that. I mean, I have an opinion too,
Let's
but
talk about
I
it.
kind of just want to hear about, because, you know, I predicted Mikey, and I thought, honestly, I'm not even joking, I thought the BAFTA was enough for her to win based on what I know from, you know, the history of it matching up with lead acting performances. But then on top of that, I knew deep down inside, and this is before Oscar night, that at least I suspected that Honora was the strongest. Definitely between that and the substance, I knew Honora was the strongest among the Academy.
Yeah.
So I just suspected that Mikey would win based on those two things. And then as the night starts playing out, we knew he had screenplay, I think, when they did editing. And when he won editing, I was like, it's over. Mikey's winning the Academy Award, period.
Yeah.
It was like they loved it.
Yeah. And that's a good point. Yeah. I did predict Demi before going into the ceremony, but when the pieces started to fit as you're talking about, I was ready to course correct myself in that regard. And I always knew, regardless of whether I predicted Demi or Mikey, it was always going to be one of those two, regardless.
Sure.
Yeah. So in a way, like, regardless of who won, it wasn't really much of a surprise. There really weren't many surprises. It's interesting because we often talked about this awards year being kind of the most unpredictable, lacking of a consensus year than ever before. But and I maybe it really wasn't. I was
going to say that on the night of, it wasn't. Yeah.
But like for good reason, as we already talked about, because it did really go the way that I felt like kind of made sense. It was always kind of a 3-horse race between Honora, Brutalist, and Conclave as the potential options for winning Best Picture. And we've had 3-horse races before. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but the stats leading up to it was certainly kind of confusing, making matters even more interesting. But yeah, seeing Mikey win, I was happy for her. She was definitely my preferred winner of the two. I do love Demi Moore in The Substance, and I think that would have been a great career win in many ways, given what that movie is about. But I do think Mikey's win was really sincere and sweet, and I love seeing her on stage there.
That's why I wanted to ask you this too, just because, you know, I am sad for Demi, much like Brendan. I preferred Mikey. I would have voted for Mikey. I predicted her. So I wanted that result deep down. But I mean, if we could have had a 3-way tie, because I also love Fernando Torres, I mean, that would have been the great.
Yeah, that would have been great too. Yeah.
All three were phenomenal. But I did want to ask you guys about that Demi narrative, because obviously Mikey doesn't have, I mean, she's 25. She doesn't have any kind of, you know, career narrative yet. Obviously, Demi not only had a narrative. I mean, I've been covering this for a long time. I can't even think of a narrative as strong as the one she had this year.
Yeah.
And Mikey still won, you know, and I think it's because of the strength of the films, right? And that's going to always be the tipping point. If your movie is winning picture, director, screenplay, I mean, you're winning as a lead performance in the film, especially
it just has such a weight to it. Yeah.
You come along with that. But I'm curious, JD, what, I mean, you know, I'll hear what you say about the Demi narrative part, and like, how much should that have played into it, or should it have? You know what I mean? I get kind of clouded with that. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the individual was thinking as they were casting their ballot. I will say, I don't think that Mikey had to win last night. I don't think she did. It would have won with editing and screenplay alone. That's really all that it needed to win picture. It didn't. I don't even know if it needed to win director. but we knew that Sean Baker was going to win for director as soon as we saw the editing win.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I somewhat agree and disagree with your notion, Brendan, about how predictable it was for each category. Sure, it came down to one or two, but comparatively to a lot of other years, there were still a lot of paths. There were a lot of certain narratives where the night could have looked a lot different before the ceremony started. Anyway, once it got going, that started to narrow itself quite a lot, and we saw
it came into focus. Yeah,
it came into focus. We saw the foreshadowing taking place, but before the ceremony started, I don't think director was wholly locked up. There were a lot of people predicting Brady Corbet to win that award.
Yeah,
or
I was
actress.
too.
That was a bit of a toss-up. Editing was another one that had gone back and forth. International film, Amelia Perez is nominated for 11 categories. I'm Still Here is in it. Like, that one was 50-50. Flo in The Wild Robot was 50-50. So comparatively to a lot of years, it did feel like there were a lot of moments last night where I didn't know exactly what was going to happen.
Well, yeah. And I guess to back up what I said earlier, I feel like every category, whether you predicted it or not, was always maybe between 2 or 3 people, or 2 or 3 movies. But I feel like the narrative going in to Oscar night was, any one of these 10 can still win Best Picture. Like, I feel like that was the narrative. Like, I've heard many people, even in the professional sphere, saying, actually, I think Nickel Boys is going to win Best Picture. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not.
You can't give credence to any of that nonsense.
No, but like, I feel like
I didn't hear much of that personally.
I feel like that was the narrative going into this, was that it was still anyone's game, which as the
we also didn't, to your point, Brendan, too, we also didn't really know what the Academy's perspective was going to be. Like, we were assuming it was going to be a certain kind of way, especially with the Guild wins for Honora, which I weighed heavily on, and thankfully ended up being right. But I mean, we didn't really know, to JD's point. But I think what me and Brendan are saying too, JD, is that, or at least for me, as I'm watching it and it started playing out, and I don't mean this to sound arrogant, even though it might, but I just was very confident in what was happening. Like, when Honora had screenplay and editor, I was like, all right, it's Honora.
No, I agree. As I noted, the focus came into picture quite clearly once the ceremony got going, for sure. That's why I wanted to emphasize moment one. Like, when Conan walked on the stage, we hadn't seen any winners yet. I think there were several categories here that were up in the air, including Best Picture, which, not all 10 of them. People saying that are trying to contrive some sort of drama here. That was
the amount of publications I saw trying to predict a complete unknown to win Best Picture, and they held to that for so long. It's like, that was the narrative going into it. It was always just between 3 movies. It was always just between 3 movies.
And I agree with that. It was between those 3. But I think at the beginning of the night, there was a reality where any of those 3 could have won.
No, I agree with that.
And that made it exciting. Now, to your point, Gerald, once we saw Sean Baker was cleaning house, we all knew what was going to happen.
Yeah, and what I said
we saw where things are going. But that's what made the night. Sorry, go ahead.
When I was going through the prediction process, what I said for a long time was that, because I predicted Conclave to win editing, and the only reason I did that, and I'm kicking myself. I should have been 20 out of 23, by the way, but I wasn't, because I fucked with myself. Well, I wasn't, Brendan. I should have been. I ended up being like 18 out of 23. But Baker, I thought, was going to win editing initially, and then I started going, well, he's not going to win. He's not going to break the record. He's going to lose something.
You overthought.
So I took away editing, and I gave it to Conclave. And if you think, as we know, as the two of you know and me, if Conclave had won that and had won editing and it had adapted, which was a shoe-in, then Conclave had the package it needed to win Best Picture.
Yeah. I agree. We talked about that last week on the show.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we know that Baker, in this scenario, had original, and he eventually would have gotten director. So he also had it. So that would have made our night as pundits, or whatever you want to call it, much more exciting, because then you have 2 movies that have a strong possibility to be in the envelope. It just depends on the preferential balloting system.
For sure.
But when that extra kind of ingredient went into the recipe for Honora, Conclave couldn't win anymore. It couldn't
No, it
win.
had no
It was
chance
the
at
best
that
case
point.
scenario.
It needed editing.
Just had adapted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yep. Yeah. Once it lost editing, that's when I think we were all done here. In fact, I tweeted that exactly. I was like, "Congratulations to Honora for winning Best Picture."
And I mean, you were
because we all knew
you were drunk off your ass, and you still do that.
and I
You know
still
what I
do.
mean?
Exactly.
You didn't lose all comprehension. Just
Not
yet
all.
there.
Yeah, exactly. I was still with it a little bit, but that's why, again, going back to my earlier sentiment, I don't think that Madison had to win actress for Honora to still win
No,
Best
I don't
Picture
either.
at the end of the night.
I don't either.
But to your point, Gerald, it's one of those things where she just went along for the ride, and I do love the performance. I think she's excellent in that film. I don't really have an issue with her winning there at all. I am heartbroken for Demi Moore, though. I predicted Moore to win. I do think the narrative there was really strong, and I'd be so curious to see what the final tally was, because it might have been one of those where it came down to one or two.
I think it was close. I think it was
I bet
really
it was
close.
very close.
It kind of reminds me of, what was it, a few years ago when everyone thought Chadwick Boseman was going to win a posthumous award, and it ended up going to Anthony Hopkins instead.
Yeah.
I feel like that's another scenario where it was probably really close, but the older members of the Academy, I'm still not over that. But like, the older members of the Academy maybe favored Hopkins in that regard.
And I do kind of wonder if that comes back to the international voters once again, because they loved Honora, going all the way back to France,
from
all the way back to May. Like they
Festival.
loved that movie, and my guess is that Demi Moore probably had more votes from the American-based voters, and Madison just got that edge with the international voters, and that was the difference in the end.
Which is interesting because Coralie's French. I mean, it's
Yeah.
essentially an international film.
Yeah.
That's
so
a good point
it is
too.
weird. I think the horror bias we haven't mentioned, and that's
And that
really why
could
Demi
be part
lost.
of
I
it
think.
too. That could be part of it.
I mean, there's several factors. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the wave of Honora is a big factor, but I think I think if this had been a dramatic role for Demi and she had this exact same narrative that she has this year,
Then she wins. She
would have
wins.
won.
Yeah.
I think the horror bias prevented her.
It probably
from getting
kept
over the
some
hump.
people away too.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I just love that we live in a world where a movie like The Substance was a major Oscar contender.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
it's a winner now.
Whether
so
it wins
that.
anything or not.
And
I
winner,
just love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
I
we're
do
going kind of
think-
long here. So I do want to kind of start to wind down, but any other thoughts you guys have on this year's Oscars?
The only thing I was going to say, and then I'm good. I was just going to say, I think what I also noticed on the night that The Brutalist was essentially number 2, I think. And I think we thought it was Conclave, but The Brutalist got score, cinematography, obviously Adrian Brody. Corbet was probably really close in director. I mean, he was like kind of like what we're saying. He was probably within, a handful of votes.
He was my prediction
think-
for director.
Yeah.
I think Brutalist was probably actually the runner-up for Best Picture, which going into the night, I thought it was Conclave.
That's
so
a good point.
I found that interesting too. But
Yeah, I did too.
yeah.
But yeah, with regard to The Brutalist, we didn't really talk much about that film that much during this conversation. I don't want to say I like this, but I think it's kind of funny how a lot of people are blaming Adrian Brody for the Hulu cutout during the
his speech, oh my God.
That was pretty wild.
God bless the guy, but
I did not like that speech at all.
I didn't either, man.
Did you guys see his Instagram post
No.
earlier today?
No, I didn't.
So it was really funny. There were some tweets going out about him doing these walking and talking Instagram stories that he does. And and of course, this morning he wakes up and he does one and he jokes about it. He jokes that I had this long speech, so I'm going to keep it brief and short. And the reel was like 30 seconds. And it was endearing. And people were kind of won over by that because he has this bad speech that he somewhat recognizes with his Instagram reel. And people were like, okay, we understand he's just a diva. That's what he is. And so people were kind of charmed by his Instagram reel and him kind of pointing fingers at himself for his speech last night.
That's a good recovery on his part then.
I guess so.
was,
Yeah. Because in the moment, it's not what he said to delay the process and maintain, his speech as long as he could, and he has a record now. I think it was 5 minutes and 40
I
seconds.
saw that.
Something
I
like
saw
that,
that. I was like,
Yeah. And it's not what he said afterwards. After what did he say? Like, this is not my first rodeo. Cut the music. I didn't mind that. I also didn't mind how he took the time to honor his parents after he did that. He then goes on this spiel, I guess you can say, about the importance of love versus hate, especially with regard to all of the anti-Semitism in the world, which makes sense given the role that he played in The Brutalist. I just didn't find any of his speech sincere. It really felt arrogant to me. Also, coupled with these really long pauses that just delayed the speech even further, it just the intent may have been there, but man, did he drag it out in the worst possible ways. I think.
And generally speaking, I didn't really like any of his speeches, but the whole season, like I always felt like, I don't know, I always felt like something was kind of off where like, he like knew he was going to be giving a speech and he was going to win, but then when he got up there, he kind of forgot.
Yeah, it's like
he knew that or whatever.
Yeah. I don't know.
And also, I thought it was funny. I saw a joke somebody made because they did start playing the music or whatever, and then he said, I've been here before, and he had. So somebody said that his speech had an intermission, just like The Brutalist.
Yeah, I saw that too.
The music was like the intermission.
Yeah, intermission ends in a messy way. Yeah, I saw a lot of people talking about that.
I just wish that Cillian Murphy gave him a giant French kiss like he gave Halle Berry when he won for the team.
Did you see they recreated that on the red carpet?
I did see that, when Halle found him on the red carpet,
That was big for him. And I'm not even joking because, a lot of people like hate him for that. And they think that it was too much. And then she obviously is okay with it. And
she
publicly, it was her initiating recreating it on the red carpet.
Yeah,
so.
even apologizing to his wife who was standing there.
Yeah,
too,
like she's like right there.
Yeah, it's like, I'm sorry, I have to do this.
I'm sorry, I gotta do this.
So that was big for him and kind of like the weird social media scheme of things,
Yeah. But anyway, so those were my thoughts there on Adrian Brody. But I did want to close out by having a final thought here on just the acting winners in general. This is, and I can't take credit for this because I saw a few people tweet this and I just thought it was really funny, but I guess this is the first time that all 4 winners were lead actors. Yeah.
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 I don't.
Good crop of lead actors.
I don't have man, you're right. And I hate it, but I just don't have the energy to like, they're going to do this shit every year. They're going all the time.
Category fraud always happens if it's going to work in their favor from a campaigning standpoint.
We just have to accept it.
I mean, even my favorite in the supporting roles, which would have been Ariana Grande. I mean, you could even make an argument she was a co-lead.
I agree. I agree.
So I mean, they're up and down the ballots this year. I mean, Kieran Culkin is the most egregious to me. Like, I feel like he is a lead. Like, there's no question.
That's a co-lead movie. It absolutely is.
In a real pain. Yeah. So,
the only thing that bothers me about that, and I do find this extremely hypocritical on the Academy's part, is that they have these mathematical formulas for other categories. And yes, I'm talking about original score, and I'm still super pissed about what they did to Hans Zimmer because his Dune score should have been nominated, and it would have if not for these stupid rules. But they don't apply that to acting at all. Yeah. And if you're going to apply math to this, you can do the same thing for these acting categories. Yeah, either have the math or don't. That's kind of where let's draw a line in the sand, do it or don't.
Yeah, because they're basically letting the studios decide or the producers decide what the actors are campaigned in. Because they're basically saying, okay, that's your lead submission. Okay, no problem.
Yep.
Or supporting or whatever. I mean, and we've seen it reverse as well, because last year with Lily Gladstone, I mean, that was a supporting role. I loved it. I mean, it was one of my favorite performances of the year in Killers of the Flower Moon, but that was a supporting performance.
Yeah.
I mean, it was. Yeah. That was a male-dominated movie with male leads. And as unfortunate as that might be from your perspective standpoint, I mean, that was a supporting role that, frankly, I don't know, Divine Joy Randolph was cleaning up that season, but it could have at least given some competition in that category.
I think that's probably why they did it.
Yeah. To your point, though, Gerald, this is going to happen. We might as well just accept it. Yeah, it's sports, and if you're not cheating in sports, you're not trying. So that's just how this is going to be.
Well said. Well said.
That's just Deflategate every single year.
Let's do
just
it.
The movie version of it. All right. Well, before we move on to our Best Picture series, thanks, Gerald, for being here. This was a lot of fun, my friend.
Absolutely. You guys are the best. And, Oscars are over, which means this award season is coming to a close. So I didn't know what I was going to talk about. So I'm glad you asked me to come on here. It has something to do tonight. So thank you.
Always glad to have you here. Yeah.
It's our pleasure, man.
But it was a blast for sure. Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
absolutely. Where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, the podcast is it's kind of in a weird spot right now. I mean, I'm obviously still going to be doing movie reviews on the pod and stuff, but I think the easiest thing is just people to find me on YouTube. Like you said at the top, I did a rebranding recently, so it's the Awards Garage, and that's across pretty much all social media too, Twitter, Facebook, everything. But it's just YouTube, the Awards Garage. So find me over there, and I obviously will have a huge focus on award season and stuff like this, but I'll also do countdowns, movie reviews, trailer reactions, all different kinds of stuff throughout the year too. It's just going to be a channel dedicated to my love of movies. So hopefully people can join me over there.
Yeah, absolutely. Go give Gerald a follow there on YouTube. Check him out on social media as well. And always appreciate you being here, my friend.
Absolutely, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, Brennan, let's talk about coffee. It's the best.
All right. How many are you in today after those pesky Oscars?
So I've had at least 4 cups of coffee today. It has been my cure.
It's been helping.
I have, I've not felt great all day. Have not
been
really
your hero.
Eaten. Yeah, I am surviving off headache medicine and coffee. And when you're drinking the best coffee in the world, man, does it become an amazing cure. I feel so much better after drinking Coffee Cult.
I feel like if you're going to drink 4 cups of coffee in one day, it's got to taste good.
Exactly. You got to emphasize that quality. You got to focus on that quality, which is why we love Coffee Cult. You got to go check them out. Coffeecult.com. That's coffee with a K, cult with a K, coffeecult.com. We're talking about the best coffee in the world. Now, what do I mean by that? Because when you're talking about the best coffee, anybody can just say that. But there is a difference between Coffee Cult and the coffee you buy at your grocery store. There is a big difference. Now, what that is that Coffee Cult sources 100% specialty grade Arabica coffee. And not only that, they go the extra mile to make sure that they are filtering out any defects. So every bean they roast is pristine. It is immaculate. And that is, you can taste that in the coffee. You can taste that difference, because when you buy a bag of specialty grade coffee, some of the beans have defects. There's stones in there, dirt. There's all kinds of things.
They're banged up a little bit. Yeah.
That's just how it's farmed. And they filter all that out. And so you're only getting the best coffee. So when I say that they roast the best coffee in the world, I mean there is an objective sense to that.
Yeah, it's the best for many reasons. As you said, it tastes the best, it is the best, but it also comes from the best because it's all ethically sourced. It's made the best.
Exactly. It's ethically sourced from Brazil, from Colombia, Ethiopia, Kenya, all over the world. You're getting the best coffee that there is out there, and it's fantastic. So go to coffeecult.com. Again, that's coffee with a K, call with a K, coffeecult.com. At checkout, and this is brand new, so pay attention, use the code ISF25.
It's here.
ISF25.
New code. It's here.
And you'll get 15% off. So that code is ISF25, 15% off. Go check them out. Coffeecult.com, and we thank them for their support. All right, Brandon, let's talk about the InSession Film Store. We're talking about T-shirts, mugs, all kinds of great merchandise and swag.
Yeah, we are.
Really supports the show.
We're talking about sexy bacon. That's what we're talking
about. Sexy bacon. Sometimes I lean into the nihilism when we're talking about award season, okay? I have been known to do that. But look, I love celebrating movies, and that's what we just did. We love celebrating movies. I think this year's Oscars was a great celebration on the whole.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
The vitriol bloodbath afterwards, not so much. Don't care about that.
That's the kind of nihilism that isn't very much the sexy bacon.
Nope. But you know what is born out of that? The best thing that ever happened to La La Land is that it lost to Moonlight, because that's what happens when you win Best Picture.
And guess what? We have a shirt that says that very thing as well, don't we?
I think I need to update that shirt to just say the best thing that happened to blank is that it lost to blank, So that way you can just fill it in each year. You can change it up as you go. Just kind of treat it like a dry erase board.
Oh yeah, they
think
can
we're
write
gonna
in
have
their
to
own
do that.
movies on there. Yeah,
Exactly,
or maybe
just write
we
in-
can have like little cutout stickers that come as an additional
Exactly.
like prop with these shirts.
Yeah, might have to do that.
Okay,
Because this
$1
happens
idea.
everywhere. Yeah, it happens every year. It's not just La La Land Moonlight. This happens all the time. So that might be coming with an update. At any rate, we have lots of fun T-shirt designs up there. Women in Session, Chasing the Gold, the flagship podcast, all kinds of different designs. Go to InSessionFilm.com/store. You'll see everything we have there. Or you can just go to tpublic.com/stores/InSessionFilm, and you'll see everything there directly on TeePublic. And they have all kinds of options that you can check out as far as sizes, colors, all that sort of jazz. So tpublic.com/stores/InSessionFilm, or just go to InSessionFilm.com/store. It is a great way to support us while looking awesome and feeling comfortable in the process. So if you go out there and you get an InSession Film t-shirt, we really do appreciate your support. All right, let's go ahead and transition to our Best Picture movie series. We are moving to the year 1961. Of course, last week we began the next phase of this series as we go through the 1960s with The Apartment in 1960. That was a really fun discussion.
Yeah.
This week, it is West Side Story, Robert Wise's iconic musical.
Yeah.
That won 10, I believe it was 10 Oscars that year.
It was a lot. It was a lot.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So there is much to discuss with West Side Story. One of the most popular musicals of all time. And it won over Fanny, The Guns Have Never Owned, The Hustler, and Judgment at Nuremberg. Have you seen any of the other films here, Brennan?
I have seen The Hustler and Judgment at Nuremberg. It's been a while since I've seen both of them, but I haven't seen Fanny. I haven't seen The Guns of Navarone.
Well, funny that you say that, because I have also seen The Hustler. Again, like you, been a minute.
Yeah.
However, this last week, I did catch up with Judgment at Nuremberg. That was a
found the
first-time
time
watch for me.
You found the time for that one?
Somehow found the time.
For
It
those
is
who
a
don't
long
know,
one,
that's
but-
a 3-hour plus movie.
Yes, it's a long one.
Yeah.
Okay, look, in all transparency, I did have to split it up into 2 viewings because, of course, kids.
You've got family.
Yeah. And with that, you sometimes have to split up those long movies. But I did find the time. I did give that one a go. And it is good. I really did like it quite a lot.
I remember liking it. That's one I haven't seen since high school. I think that was one I had to watch for some type of history class or something like that. So it has been quite a while. But I do remember liking it quite a bit at that time.
Yeah. It is admittedly kind of funny through the lens of 2025, because there's a moment in that movie where they transition all of the German speaking characters into English, so an English audience can understand both sides of the courtroom drama.
Sure.
But they're all wearing headphones as interpreters are speaking into
oh gosh
into the character, like
okay, I forgot about that. Yeah.
And so it's really funny how when they're in the courtroom, they're like listening intently into it, even though everyone is speaking English. It's just
I do remember that now. Oh my goodness, you definitely sparked a memory with that one. That's odd. That's
it's so funny. It's really, really funny. But that aside, it's actually a really good movie. But you do have to kind of actively move past that.
You have to remember it's a movie from 1961.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm sure it made sense for audiences at the time. I don't know. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was goofy then too. I don't know.
It's a quasi sci-fi movie of sorts.
Yeah, it's a little weird, but once you move beyond that, good movie.
Yeah, I remember liking it.
Anyway, we are here to talk about West Side Story. As we noted, directed by Robert Wise and also Jerome Robbins. We have to note here, he did co-direct this, sort of. He did end up leaving the project halfway through, but he still won an honorary Oscar for his choreography here. So despite only being with the project for a certain amount of time, still wins an Oscar, is still credited as a co-director here. And we will, of course, talk about the choreography and the dancing of the film.
Yeah.
So those two are our credited directors here. It is, of course, based on the stage play West Side Story that began in 1957. It stars Natalie Wood, Richard Beamer, Russ Tamblyn, Rita Moreno, George Chakiris, and a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film. It is West Side Story, after all. If you're not familiar with this film, although I'm sure you all are, but just in case.
What a silly statement.
Two youngsters from rival New York City gangs fall in love, but tensions between their respective friends build toward tragedy. Man, that sounds a little familiar. What is that perhaps inspired by? Maybe we'll get to the bottom of that as we go here.
Don't we know that like pretty much everything comes from William Shakespeare, right?
Yeah, exactly. It all starts with him. It all starts modern narratives.
We've either learned one of two things. It either starts from William Shakespeare or it starts from Jesus. It's like one of the two, right? Like if you're the Lion King, you're either Hamlet or the Bible. It's one of the two.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Before we jump into our opening thoughts, I meant to do this a moment ago and I jumped the gun here a little bit. What is your history with this film? You've seen this film before, I presume?
Quite a few times, yeah. And I think we even talked about our history with this movie when we reviewed Spielberg's film in 2021. Which, for those who didn't listen to that review, it's been some time. You know, I forget everything that we talked about during that review of Spielberg's film a few years ago. But this West Side Story, the film from 1961, is one I have seen quite a few times. I've seen it all the way back since I was maybe 10 or 12 years old. It's one of my mom's favorite movies. So it's always been one that I grew up with and always had a bit of an attachment towards. So it is definitely a movie I've been familiar with for some time.
Yeah, I have certainly seen the film as well. I don't really remember the first time that I saw this movie, if I'm being honest, but most likely, as is the case with a lot of things for me, it wouldn't have been until high school or college because that's when I really started to dabble into film in a more serious way. I didn't really have much access when I was a kid.
Have you ever seen a stage production of this show at all?
I have not. I would love to.
Yeah, I did. It was I did see a very small production of it. And it's really interesting when you could see the exact same story play out, but in a completely different medium, and the sensation it provides is just so different. It's really interesting how that translates. And this is one of those shows that I think honestly is best depicted on the stage. I think that really is where it was made for, which many people would agree, I feel like.
Oh, I'm sure it's great. I'm sure it's absolutely fantastic. I would love to see that someday and be able to see the differences. I've only seen the movies. The only comp I can make here is the Spielberg film, and I'm sure we will
make comparisons. Yeah, we will. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't make a comp to the stage play, but I would love to. I would absolutely love to see it at some point. All right, with all of that laid out, Brendan, what did you think about the film from 1961, West Side Story?
Well, I mentioned that I've kind of grown up with this film, so I do have a bit of a nostalgic relationship to it. And when you have that kind of nostalgia blinder, if you will, it's hard to dislike anything like this. I still do really like this movie. I think it's very vibrant, very colorful, very well made. We're going to be making a lot of comparisons to the Spielberg film from a few years ago, because I think it's necessary when talking about how both films translate the same story and how they weirdly succeed and maybe even fail for some of the same reasons, just in different ways. And I think that's where the comps are going to be really interesting with this conversation. But where this movie succeeds, just like Spielberg's film, it really does come down to Robert Wise's direction. I know he is co-credited as a director with Jerome Robbins, who really handled a lot more of the choreography and all the dance routines and all those things.
Numbers.
Yeah. And it shows. It absolutely shows because it's a very dancey movie. It really is. And the film does capitalize on that very well to the point that you could tell how this was such a big influence on many movie musicals specifically that would come after that really do relish in long takes and in-camera choreography. This is very much in the tradition of something like Singing in the Rain, which was only 9 years prior to this movie coming out, if I'm not mistaken. It's actually pretty closer in line to that movie than many people might not even realize. But I do think as a movie, West Side Story is still very good. It's a very good movie, mostly because of just how vibrant and colorful and electrifying it is as a production and as a directorial experience. And I think it's well performed as well. We'll talk about a lot of these performances and how they convey that drama. But I do think it's very good. The burning question, I think, will be, do we like Spielberg's version more or do we like this version more? I'm not going to answer that yet because I think that's actually a complicated question. Maybe we'll get to that as this conversation goes, but I still do really like this movie quite a bit.
Yeah, this film is iconic, right? It's one of the most iconic musicals ever made. And it's easy to see why. The songs are infectious. That opening sequence is quite electrifying, but there are so many legendary numbers here. Where does one even begin? Jerome Robbins' choreography was revolutionary. His famous honorary Oscar for this film, I think, is very, very well earned. I love how expressive and emotive the dancing is in this film. It's obviously rooted in ballet, and I love the elegance that comes with every leap and gesture. But there's also this greasy quality to it as well that gives each number a striking duality in terms of formal movements and this violent underbelly. I absolutely adore that about the film. It's really phenomenal work. The cinematography, the production design, it's all ravishing. The use of color here is extraordinary. The performances, I think, are really good. There's so much to love about this film, technically speaking, but I think what's most compelling about its aesthetics and world building is how it creates something that feels really big. There's an epic quality to this film that's grandiose and imposing, all for a narrative that's actually quite small and intimate. For all the fighting between the Sharks and the Jets and all the turf war violence that we see, it's for a small pocket of New York City. They're fighting over a few streets. It's literally a block of a large city. I just love how all of this is over nothing. But that is something the characters speak to in the film. They know that it's meaningless in the grand scope of New York, but it means something to them. There's such a deep intimacy to youthful vigor here that is so fascinating, especially when juxtaposed to the film's bombacity as a musical. I love that duality. I think it's
a good point.
Really well rendered here in this really great way that Spielberg was also able to replicate.
It's still
his
there.
Own Spielbergian way. It's still very much there. So it speaks to how great the source material is in terms of creating that dichotomy foundationally. But to your point about this being great as a stage musical, what I love about these two films, especially as it relates to that duality, the medium of cinema is able to really expose that in a very different way that the stage wouldn't be able to replicate. And that is what makes these two films, but the 1961 film, since that's what we're talking about specifically, that's what makes this film so legendary. That's what makes it so great. I think it all kind of boils down to that. And I love it.
We often talk a lot about how sense of place and setting almost feels like a character in some movies. We actually talked about that quite a bit during this particular series just last week, JD, with The Apartment, how New York City itself felt like a character in that movie. That's perhaps even more so here. as far as movies that really take advantage of the urban grime that it's depicting to the point that it actually feels like the main character in a lot of ways. I feel like that's even louder here than many other films we've talked about as of late. I think Spielberg was able to capture that same thing as well in his film in a very different way. I think his film certainly captures more of the dirt and the dilapidation of New York City, whereas this film and Robert Wise and his team, there's a lot more color happening here, which certainly makes sense because this is the 1960s. This is when movies were really becoming more expressive and experimenting with Technicolor and things like that. So it makes a lot of sense for them to capitalize on that here at this time in the early 60s. But it still feels as if New York City is that nucleus pulling all of these things together, like it is the main character. You change this city to any other urban territory, it completely changes the vibe of the movie. Even the opening credits, which linger on this long overture, which almost looks like just a nothing image until you realize it is a fragment of New York City.
It's a great shot.
It goes on for almost 10 minutes. It's kind of incredible. It kind of hypnotic in a way. It's certainly, kind of predating what Stanley Kubrick would do in 2001: A Space Odyssey just a few years later, the only difference that being just a black screen. But it sort of takes the same kind of same type of agenda, if you will. But it really does a great job establishing the city skyline as a main character and pulling all of these things together, which makes your point so valid.
Yeah, I love that. I love how grandiose this film looks visually. It is stunning. The cinematography here is really quite fantastic. There are a lot of bold hues, particularly red and blue hues. There are striking yellows and browns here as well. And I love how the film uses that coloration to reflect character emotions or the allegiances that they make throughout the film. The Jets and the Sharks have various tones, whether they be cool tones or warm tones, to distinct the rivalry between them. Or you look at Maria's transformation throughout the film. She starts off in these soft whites, and then by the end, those whites are completely stained, given the
very red, literally quite red.
Yeah, literally quite red. So I love how this film uses that coloration to tell this story. It's not there just to visually allure us to what's happening on screen, although it is effective in that regard. But it also is a complementary tool to tell this story. I think you could say the same thing about the use of space and movement here. Again, we're talking about a few streets in New York City, a block.
The Upper West Side,
The Upper West Side. And yet, despite how claustrophobic the film really is, it feels like there's so much space given the movement of the characters and the camera as well.
Yeah.
That it creates this spectacle.
It feels like this huge world.
Yes, it feels like a huge world that is mapped out over miles and miles and miles. And yet it is all contained to this very tight space. Well, that really means nothing to, especially the adult characters in this film, but it means something to these kids. And so like it kind of like I love how the film uses space and color and movement to highlight the naivete of these characters and how that's fueling a lot of the choices they make, because that's ultimately what it is. It's a bunch of kids making dumb mistakes over something that is meaningless.
Over territory. Yeah. Over your hometown, essentially. Yeah.
And again, not just, it's not like we're talking about World War II type territory, a street. No. Like
we're talking about a street.
We're talking about
maybe a basketball court alongside a street, if you want to add a little bit of additional layers to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's it. Like it's a street and a half a park. Like that's what they're fighting over. So like I love that dichotomy here.
What I love about what you're saying there too, and this is something that I think this film does really well, and Spielberg did this very well too, is that because it is so contained to a small sliver of one of the biggest cities in the world, the film does a really great job creating this sense of geography as if you kind of know where things are and where people are going. It kind of creates this mapping of sorts for you to understand it, which I think actually adds to that level of nostalgia that I think it's going for, that these are a bunch of kids that have this emotional tie to essentially their hometown, and they don't want to lose sight of that. So it allows us to see what they see. That familiarity that it gives us is what they see in their own hometown. So creating a really good geographical sense to this and mapping it out so efficiently, I think is why it works so well. I never found myself lost within these city grounds. Like navigating it was actually pretty seamless. I felt like I knew where everything was and where to get to everything. And that's really good, a really good production design more than anything else that I think really needs to be praised here too.
No, the production design is phenomenal. There is such a great cogency to the mapping of the film that is wonderful. And you couple that with the music of this film, which is fantastic. Shout out to Leonard Bernstein and everyone.
We got to mention that name. The maestro himself.
Mention Leonard Bernstein.
we got to mention Bradley Cooper.
Exactly, Bradley Cooper. Exactly. Love what he did with this film. He was great.
Oh, time traveler.
Exactly. But the music here is great. The songs are really catchy and fun, as I noted earlier, transcending this film, transcending time and space. Maybe appropriate to our little Bradley Cooper conversation there.
Yeah, sure. There you go.
So much of this film hit the zeitgeist in such a big way, and it continues on to today. Right? West Side Story is still something that is popular within American culture 60 some odd years later. So the music is great. And then, as I was talking about my opening thoughts, the choreography to this film is so unique. And again, I love the juxtapositions of the film where you have these two rival gangs, these men, these boys that are emotionally vulnerable and wearing these facades, these masculine facades throughout the film. I love how the film uses that to deconstruct what the film is really about. And they're doing that through this incredible choreography that you just don't associate with those masculine behaviors. The gestures, the leaping, the dancing.
It's very smooth and buoyant in a way.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love that about the film as well. Like the choreography, again, we're talking about the technicalities of the film complementing characterization and drama and what we see on screen narratively. And that is the brilliance of the film, and the choreography is absolutely no different. I love that here.
And it's not often where we see choreography in a musical like this that almost feels just as much a form of communication as it does a great dance sequence. Many musicals we see, whether it be on the stage or in film form, you get to a great dance number. A lot of times it's just a great dance number for the sake of defining it as a musical. But sometimes you'll get choreography that's designed to almost feel like dialogue in a way, without actual dialogue. And I'm trying to be careful to make this comparison, but it almost feels like sign language in a way. When these characters dance in a particular way, it almost feels like they're talking to each other. And that's something Spielberg did as well. I think that's just kind of embedded in the DNA of West Side Story, and how the choreography is just as much a tool for dialogue in a way as it is, for dance sequences. It's just as important in different ways. But they really do capitalize on that here, lingering on dance sequences without cutting, very rarely ever cutting. And major credit has to go to Daniel Fapp for his cinematography and actually lingering on certain shots and being so efficient and smooth with all of it. It's so effortless, and maintaining that sense of communication throughout the dance sequences too.
No, I agree. And maybe pun intended, but I think there is a great dance between the choreography, the camera, and the editing, because so much of what we see is in frame. And I do love that about traditional Hollywood musicals, that everything is all in frame and there's glorious editing happening around the movement in the frame, depending on what's happening in the scene dramatically. And sometimes it's a little bit more rapid than what we see with other numbers. The In America sequence, for example, has a little bit more of a rhythmic editing to it than some of the other ones.
Yeah, it's also more contained too. It takes, that's one of the bigger differences between this film and Spielberg's, is that Spielberg took it to the streets in daylight and kind of changed it up a bit. But here it's very contained to a very different setting. It's
like on
top
rooftop.
It's on a rooftop. It also takes place at night, if I'm not mistaken. It's very different in that regard.
It is for sure. So the rhythmic editing certainly makes a lot more sense there than some of the other sequences that are more in the open, and you can let the camera linger and move a little bit more with the characters. But still, like, either way, I do love that about the film. I think each musical number does a great job of breathing life into the film, musically, with energy. With how the characters interact with each other. There's certainly a lot of fun to be had there as well. And it's a joy. It's an absolute joy to watch. I think there's a perfect marriage of editing, camera work, and choreography.
Oh, and speaking of editing, which really, things that really get our film critic brains like jumping for joy, is when you see certain transitions between scenes that just make you go, oh, they just never made them like this, and like they haven't made a movie like this in so long. Watching Maria do a little twirl before it transitions from her room into the actual dance when she meets Tony, beautiful seamless editing. Even the use of Tony and Maria first meeting at that dance, and the way that the camera blurs out certain images. We've seen that technique in many movies, but not quite like this. And it's hard to explain that it's blurring certain images out while keeping everything else in focus in a very strange and hypnotic way. But there's something about the way this film is made that just has such a charm to it. It really is one of those premier examples of, they don't make them like they used to.
They don't.
It really embodies that. This is why I'm so excited to do this particular Best Picture series, because we also have another Robert Wise film to talk about in a few weeks, I think, with The Sound of Music. And say what you will about that movie, one thing that can't be denied is how well made the film is. So that's something we'll talk about again. But he was definitely a filmmaker that knew how to utilize film as a visual medium. He really knew
a great technical craftsman, for sure. Yeah. I mean, this is one of those movies where you can mute it, although I
wouldn't recommend that.
I don't know why you would want to do that, but you could do that, and you'll be struck from moment to moment with just how gorgeous it is. Every frame here is popping with some sort of color, and it's not just the use of color is brilliant, as we noted earlier. It is a thematic and narrative tool here. But the composition and framing from scene to scene is really quite great. I mean, you noted some of the transitions here. That musical number, forgive me, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's the one where Riff is singing and he walks into this darkly lit space, but you have these pillars behind him. So there's like these split yellow hues coming from behind him, and he's wearing like a yellow suit as well. So like there's a interesting contrast there.
Yeah, it's great.
And it's one of those shots where you're like, God damn, this film is just so like it's working on all cylinders. You're just, like I found myself, and I've seen this film before, and yet I'm watching it again, and I'm just continually struck by how incredible it looks.
It honestly helps having just come off a movie musical like Wicked and comparing it to this.
That's subconsciously like in the back of your mind when you're watching these movies too. And you're like, man, everything looks so good now.
It's like, why couldn't Wicked look like this?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And another thing I want to talk about too, transitioning to the film thematically a little bit. There's certainly a lot to talk about regarding love and fate. There's obviously a lot of Romeo and Juliet happening here. There are themes of prejudice and racism, violence and revenge. There are notions about the American dream here as well. However, one element of the film that I don't know if it gets talked about enough, maybe it does, and I simply haven't seen that conversation. But one thing that struck me on this rewatch is how the film portrays authority figures and their absence here mostly.
Yeah.
Right. So like there's a lot of conversation about the gang and the rivalry. There's the music and the choreography. And we've spent all of this conversation on that already. It's really great. But the role of authority in this story, I think, is an underrated yet crucial element where the adults, the police, the social workers, the store owners are either corrupt, apathetic, or completely powerless. When you look at Lieutenant Schrank and Officer Krupke, who are supposed to maintain some sort of order, yet they're openly biased against the Puerto Rican Sharks while treating the Jets with a mix of annoyance and condescension.
Sure.
Schrank in particular is interesting because he hates both gangs, but instead of stopping the violence, he escalates it by making racist comments and allowing tensions to fester a little bit. He's not really interested in justice. He just wants to keep things quiet on his own terms. Then there's Doc, one of the only adult characters who genuinely tries to reach these young men, particularly Tony. He is a voice of reason, but he's completely ignored, which again points back to youth of vigor and how limited your perspective of the world might be at that age. The younger characters are so caught up in their own world of anger and loyalty that they can't or won't listen to someone that is trying to help them. So whether it's the police failing, the community failing these kids, either way, they're left to navigate this conflict without any real guidance. The absence of adults, I think, is such a fascinating element to this film that has a powerful effect as the tragedy begins to unfold. Again, I don't know if that's talked about enough, but I think it speaks to perhaps a larger microcosm of America when you're talking about broken systems that lead to this kind of hate and violence unraveling. I think the material here leads to a great conversation about all that.
Yeah. I think you hit on something that really might be the big thing, perhaps the biggest thing that separates this film from Spielberg's interpretation. Because I think both films have that in a way, but I think this film, Robert Wise's film, is more interested in that maybe because this film feels a bit more innocent in a way, a bit more naive of just watching kids fend for themselves who are really not ready to do so. And then you have someone like Lieutenant Schrank, as you say, who almost seems to be, I don't know if antagonizing is the right word, but he seems to be fueling this feud even further because he realizes that maybe the way to actually end this violence is to just let it play out and do nothing about it. So, which is maybe perhaps a relevant notion you can take from that. I think there maybe is some political and social relevancy to that very idea. But I think with regard to what you're saying, there is more of an innocence to this movie by comparison. Even someone like Doc, who maybe is the only quote unquote adult figure that shows compassion, he's not as present as maybe you would like him to be in order to make that influence. So these kids feel more alone than maybe compared to Spielberg's film, which really had more of a presence in that regard when you actually cast Rita Moreno again, but playing basically the Doc role. And of course, you're bringing her back in a very nostalgic way. You're going to utilize her more. So that film definitely has more of an overarching adult presence to it. And I understand why. So then it's able to tap more into maybe the sociopolitical side of this story, which I think Spielberg's film is more interested in. I think him and Tony Kushner really were more adamant about portraying that story and not just a timeless way, but also making it feel contemporary. I think that was definitely their goal.
And I think it was effective in that regard.
I agree. But I think allowing this film in particular to feel a bit more distant from that lingering side of adulthood, I think not only separates it from Spielberg's version, but I think creates really a tale of lost innocence in a way. Watching these kids that are essentially alone and fending for themselves, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that resonates here. And I think in addition to what you're saying as far as how Spielberg was able to take this material and kind of create these new fascinating angles where it's more socio-political, I think the casting of that film also helps in that regard, because one of the major problems of this film through a 2025 lens is its egregious use of brown face.
Oh gosh, yeah. It's
not great.
It's not
great.
And this is not to say that Spielberg's film is better performed, but it is more appropriately casted. I'll simply say.
Yeah, the brown face here isn't great, obviously. And I think, again, I'm looking at this through a 2025 lens. Maybe there's a separation that can be made if we're just talking about the film in a vacuum. And I think you can have that conversation because it's
absolutely
themes on the American dream, on prejudice and racism in a vacuum that's still very much intact here. And it's
still felt.
effective.
It's still felt. These performances are still good, regardless of someone like George Chakiris, who plays Bernardo, being of, I think, Greek descent. He's not Puerto Rican, but his performance is still very good in emulating those ideas.
Exactly. But when the film is very directly tackling prejudice and racism and the sharks face discrimination at every turn from their rivals and also the police, as we noted a moment ago, and they talk about the tension of being in America and what that means versus being back in Puerto Rico, where they don't necessarily have the same freedoms or at least the same opportunities. That is a big talking point here.
It is. You're right.
That might be a little undermined when you're throwing in brown face in the mix.
It's a little
there.
funny. Yeah.
That it's a bit like working against itself. Like, let's talk about prejudice and racism while we're actively being racist. Like, it just, it doesn't, like, again, through today's lens, it doesn't necessarily, like, it doesn't have as much of an impact, or at least that impact is maybe slightly altered a little bit, even if in a vacuum it works, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And I think, thankfully, a film like this has more on its mind than just that very idea, which allows the film to get away with so much else. And honestly, if you were to kind of tier list the number of themes that this film is really interested in conveying, that idea, I think, is maybe kind of halfway there, or maybe even lower than some of these other ones. I actually think the film is more interested in that youthful innocence and that naivete and that sense of place that we talked about earlier. Those are the things that really make this film as timeless as it is, outside of just the technical merits that we highlighted already.
No, I agree. There is a lot here about youth and rebellion. I noted earlier that the male characters, especially, they're wearing this faux bravado very adamantly with some characters on the external. And you see it come through in their rage and their willingness to jump into the fight, so to speak. And how that is undermined through the choreography, I think, is really great. But even narratively speaking, where the film ends, given the tragedy that we see, there is an emphasis on that for sure. There's so much emphasis on hope and despair as it relates to the romance and the Romeo and Juliet of it all as well. And that's obviously a big part of this story. So I agree with you. While the racism element of it, the American dream, that is a big part of this movie. You can't really ignore it, but that is far from being the only thing about this film. It is thematically a little dense.
It is, but it's
overly dense, I guess you could argue, but
maybe
I think it all is mostly effective here.
But it's because it's still a simple story.
Ironically, through all of those various avenues, that's what leads to the absence of adults here kind of resonating, I think, as loudly as it does.
Yeah, well, it is still a simple story. It's a very easy narrative. It's not overly complicated, which allows the film to be I guess, interpreted any way that you want. You could maybe pinpoint on certain themes that maybe resonate with you more than others. And between this film and Spielberg's film, they're clearly prioritizing different things. As we mentioned, Spielberg's film is certainly more interested in the sociopolitical edge that this story has, the element of racism at play. That is definitely more. That film is definitely more interested in those things. Whereas this film, it's still interested in that, but there's other things happening that I guess we're more willing to forgive the film for being a bit, let's say, behind the times, or at least not quite politically correct in a 2025 lens. We'll simply say it hasn't aged well in that regard, but there are other things about it that has. So you can kind of distance yourself from some of those things.
I agree. No, I do agree with that. As we kind of wind down here, I do want to ask you this. What do you think about the performances here comparatively to Spielberg's film?
That's a very interesting question, because I think that question then tailors into the overarching question that I'm sure some people listening might be asking themselves, or want us to answer at least. Which version of this movie do we prefer? Do we prefer this film, or do we prefer Spielberg's? Because like I mentioned earlier, I think both films have very similar successes and failures. Just like, I guess the weight of those successes and failures kind of vary between each film. I think in many ways both films are very much successes for their technical merits, but for very different reasons. I think both films are very well performed, but also for very different reasons. As we mentioned, Spielberg's film is more appropriate in its casting. It does the proper sociopolitical research, right? By really looking to find Latino actors to play Latino roles. So it's very adamant about that. I think overall, Spielberg's film is better performed because I think it actually has more time dedicated to the supporting roles, primarily because of how great Mike Feist is in that movie as Riff. I think he's so good in that. He might as well have been the main character, I feel like. In fact, something we said is that he probably should have been Tony. He probably should have been Tony in that film. And Rachel Zegler's great in Spielberg's film. Natalie Wood is amazing in this film as well. I think both films do have a Tony problem, though. I think that's maybe where the similar failures are. But
like performatively, or how the character is utilized?
More so how the character is utilized. I think even going back to the original source material, perhaps, I just don't think Tony is that interesting of a character by comparison to the others. But I will say, if there is another big difference to make between this film and Spielberg's, I do think Richard Beymer is a much stronger performer than Ansel Elgort. So if I were to give this film maybe an edge over Spielberg's, because we have two great leads here, I think the romance works better in this one. So like the connection and the chemistry between the two leads, like that whole sequence where they're basically playing with the mannequins at that store, pretending that they are their parents, introducing them to each other, is very playful and very endearing, which is something I just didn't sense enough of in Spielberg's film, because Ansel Elgort is such a flat face in that movie. It just doesn't really work. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, that I think the performances are very good here. I think they're maybe better in Spielberg's in some avenues, but also better here in other avenues, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I am with you. It pains me to say, because I really do love Spielberg's version a lot, and every time it trends on Twitter, it makes me want to reevaluate that film, because I didn't have it in my top 10. I don't even know if I had it in my top 20. It might have just been on the outside, but it's not because I don't like the film or Spielberg's craft. He is on God mode with his direction in that film. It is unbelievable from a technical perspective, but there are elements of the storytelling, particularly around Tony, that I just don't think works. And that's mostly a foundational element with the material, as you noted. And Ansel Elgort, I just don't think was the right choice for that character at all.
He's so bad in that movie.
Couple those things together, and the Tony of the film, when we're talking about the best movies of 2021, I just can't go that high with West Side Story. As much as I deeply want to because of the technical merit, I just can't go that high because I think the Tony of it all, and when you're talking about the top 10, 20 movies of the year, you really are, you're nitpicking to get into the disparity a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that element works. As great as everything else is, so other films kind of rise above it for me. As much as I would love to have it in my top 5.
But see,
if
like
it wasn't for the Tony element, I might have had it in my top 5 or top 10.
That's a huge thing in that movie. Like that's a huge breaking point in many ways.
One of the leading characters. Like it's Romeo. Like I'm sorry, but if Romeo isn't working, you got a little bit of a problem. Yeah. And unfortunately, Spielberg isn't able to really get around that either. I think to really get around that, I think you'd have to really rewrite the film quite drastically, like fundamentally, to give more to that character, which I think you could do. Like if you wanted to adapt this in a new and different way and reinvigorate it. But obviously that's not what Spielberg wanted to do. But I think, at least for me, I think that's the only thing that would solve the Tony of it all. Now that said, I don't like Elgar or the writing of the character in the Spielberg film. I do like Richard Beymer here, though. He has a charming presence that is infectious. That is really, really great. And he kind of saves it,
because I still think Tony is an underwritten character in both films. But I think at least here you have a good performer kind of filling in those gaps where it's necessary, at least enough of the way. I do think Richard Beymer is really talented.
I agree. And so like I think like overall in terms of the performances, that's really the only thing where I'd say this film has more of an edge, except for maybe Rita Moreno, you could say arguably is a better Anita here, even though
even though they both won Oscars for the same character. How interesting. It really does come full circle.
Yeah. But like I think the cast in both of them on the whole is really good though.
Sure.
Is really good. I do love the performances. And honestly they're both great. If I had to choose one, I'd probably go with Spielberg, but I don't think it's by a lot though.
No, it's because different things work about each individual film. That's why I said they have very similar successes and failures, but the weight of those successes and failures are so different between the two. So on one hand, I think I might prefer the technical side of Spielberg's film just because I love what Spielberg does personally.
Yeah.
But even though both films are technical successes, right? I just think one maybe is more interesting in that regard. And then again, I think both films kind of have a Tony problem, but I think this film from 1961 has less of a Tony problem because it has Richard Beymer front and center that's able to fill in those gaps. So like there are similar things here. It's just the weight between those things does vary, which in a way, I guess in the end, I kind of find myself saying I like them equally. I think.
I mean, that's kind of where I'm at. I think they both are really, really great, and where their weaknesses lie, there is a distinction there. And if you gave me an option, said you could only watch one of these for the rest of your life, you only get one, and you came to me and said, Brendan, you're taking Spielberg and you're giving me the 1961 version. Okay. Oh, that's terrible. What a
I mean, that actually is kind of terrible because you can argue the need for both of them. Because
like,
on one hand,
I wouldn't be that sad. Like, I'm not gonna walk away that angry. Like, if you didn't catch the sarcasm there, like
I know that. I will say this though: if we were forced to pick and we ended up picking this film and Spielberg's film was completely wiped off the face of the earth, God knows what happens to the future of movie musicals without that movie. That's a scary thought if we get even more dirgy looking Wickeds of the world.
Not for me. More West Side Stories,
please.
Yes, I will absolutely take that for sure.
Maybe Spielberg should direct Wicked for good. Let's get rid of John M. Chu and just get Spielberg in there last minute to fix that movie.
Don't think that's gonna happen. I would like to see another Spielberg musical, and it was really funny because I do remember in 2021 approaching that movie I was like, I don't know about this. Spielberg doing a musical,
I was
didn't
pretty
seem
cynical.
like
I was pretty cynical about it.
It didn't seem like a good fit, and then he just.
Well,
I should have never have doubted the go.
We've
Never again.
I feel like that's another great example of something we've had to learn along the way, is that sometimes the best version of something comes from someone who has no experience doing that thing, because they don't have to follow the rules of that thing. It's like it's like if a filmmaker makes a horror movie, but they've never dabbled in horror before, they might make something that's never been done before within the horror medium. So Spielberg kind of did the same thing with musicals. He's never done a musical before, and he directs those musical sequences like no one's ever made a musical before.
I know.
Like it's so great.
I'm never doubting him again. That's on me. I was a moron. Never again. Never doing that again. At any rate, West Side Story, great movie. I do love it. I obviously haven't seen all of the nominees here, but of the two that I have seen, I would take it over The Hustler and Judgment at Nuremberg.
Oh, okay. I think I would still take The Hustler. I have to see it again. Yeah, I know I would.
Again, it's been years that if I watch that tomorrow, maybe this would change. Maybe this clip would be very outdated at that point. I don't know.
Yeah, so but I'm with you. I still say that with a bit of an asterisk because I'm not really sure. At this point, I think I would prefer The Hustler. But I like
that movie a lot though too.
Yeah, I do too.
I don't know. I might be just so entranced. I just watched this the other day, and I feel like I'm on a high from its visual feast. And maybe it is the wicked of it all these days. I don't know, but I gave me a high that not a lot of movies do.
I mean, with this being a visual feast, we've got an even bigger visual feast to contend with next week.
Hey, I was just about to say that's a West Side Story. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, let us know. Hit us up on social media, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. And next week, as we continue this series, we are going to get to a little film called Lawrence of Arabia. No small feat. No small feat.
4-hour movie.
So, a little 4-hour movie. Yeah. I don't know if I'll have an opportunity this week for another Judgment at Nuremberg. I think I'm going to have, that's going to be three watches probably.
Well, so let me ask you this. So I think we talked about this last week too in preparation for the next week, but okay, with Lawrence of Arabia winning in 1962, have you seen any of the other films that it was nominated against at this point?
Okay, To Kill a Mockingbird, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. The Longest Day.
Mm-hmm.
Although it's been a while. I think that's it. I don't think I've seen Mutiny on the Bounty. The Music Man I for sure haven't seen.
Yeah. Those are the same ones. Those are the same ones that I've seen. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I would love to try to catch up with the other two, but not going to happen.
I think we need to prioritize 4 hours.
Thursday will be part 1, 2, and 3 of Lawrence of Arabia.
Absolutely.
That's how it's going to be in my household. So, at any rate, we'll go ahead and end there. So, appreciate everyone tuning in. As we close here for this episode, just want to note we will have a couple of reviews this week. It is February. We have hit the dog days of February because we are going to have probably relatively short reviews as we talk about Last Breath, which is coming to a cable television network near you. So be on the lookout for that. And I'll just give it away. I didn't hate the movie. It's a good dad movie. It's a good dad movie.
That's a heck of a good praise right there. It's
it'll leave you breathless. Very much pun intended there.
Oh yeah, good job.
And then we're also going to be talking about the new film on Apple, The Gorge. And I wanted to gorge my eyes out after watching that movie. So there's my little teaser.
That'll be a 5-minute review.
That'll be a little one. Like wasted opportunity. I'll just leave it. I'll leave it there.
Great idea. Great idea. Honestly, it's kind of like Hard Eyes. Great romance. Nothing else works.
Yeah, exactly. We'll get more into it later on in the week. So be on the lookout for that. New Chasing the Gold dropped. Yesterday, as this episode is released anyway, obviously the Oscars happened over the weekend. Chasing the Gold got to it before we did. So go and check out that. Shadon and Erica in the same room together. I would love for Brendan and I to be able to do that.
It's been a while, man.
Again, sometimes, but it's so long. Would love to do that one day, but that was very fun. So you can go and check that out. And of course, there'll be a Women in Session episode at the end of the week as well. So moving even further into 2025, as we are now into March. And then, you know, despite the reviews this week, we have a really fun one coming up this weekend. Yeah, I'm very, very excited about. So March will pick up. I think March is going to pick up. That's the short of it.
Oh yeah. There are some that are coming out this month that I'm really looking forward to.
Absolutely. All right. With all that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast.